Yo, welcome to Goofy Harry. Got an absolute banger for you today. What if Geralt turned Jon Snow into the first Witcher of Westeros? Like, subscribe, comment below. Let's go. Chapter 1. The wolf in the snow. The sky tore open like wet parchment, and Geralt of Rivia fell through it screaming curses instead of prayers, because prayers had never done him a lick of good, and he saw no reason to start now. He'd been in the middle of something simple. A drowner nest along the Pontar Delta, 6-coin contract, the kind of job that barely paid for the oil to clean his swords afterward. Then the world had gone wrong in that particular way. It had been going wrong for weeks. Sky bruising green at midday, will-o-wisps dancing where no marsh gas should be, dead things standing up that should have stayed dead. The mages were calling it instability in the weave, said the spheres were grinding against each other again like millstones with no grain between them, and every witcher on the continent had noticed the game had changed. Portals opening, things crossing that had no business crossing. He hadn't planned on becoming one of those things. A tear opened behind a drowner he just gutted, silent and black at the edges like a wound that wouldn't clot. And a wild hunt rider came through it on a horse made of frost and old hunger, and Geralt had exactly enough time to think, oh, that's new, before the rider's blade opened his side to the ribs, and the world folded up around him and swallowed him whole. Cold. That was the first thing. Not the damp Pontar cold he knew, but something with teeth, something that got into a man's marrow and started chewing. He hit ground. Actual ground, snow-crusted and hard as iron beneath the white, and rolled twice before momentum let him go, and the pain in his side flared bright enough that even his Witcher-trained body flinched from it. Above him, the sky was the wrong color. Not the sickly green-black of the tear he'd fallen through, but a flat, merciless gray, snow falling from it in fat, silent flakes. And somewhere very far off he heard wind moving through pines that smelled wrong, too clean, too cold. No rot beneath them the way a real forest always had a little rot beneath it. New world, he thought, distantly, the way a man thinks about a broken leg before the shock wears off and the screaming starts. Wonderful. He tried to sit up and got about halfway before his body reminded him, quite forcefully, that a wild hunt blade had opened him from hip to ribs, and he'd been losing blood into unfamiliar snow for, he didn't know how long. Long enough that the blood beneath him had gone the color of rust, and the cold had started doing the work that shock usually did, numbing him from the outside in. Not dying here, he decided, with the flat stubbornness that had kept him alive through worse. Not in the snow. Not without knowing where the fuck here even is. He got a hand to his side, pressed hard, felt the wet heat of it soak immediately through his glove, and reached with the other hand for the little leather satchel at his belt where he kept what remained of his potion, swallow, for the healing, if there was enough left, if the trial-hardened liver in his gut could still process toxin after toxin the way it always had. His fingers found the satchel torn half open, vials cracked, their contents either spilled into the snow or frozen solid and useless. Of course. Of course they were, he laughed. It came out as a wet, ugly sound, more cough than laughter, and it hurt like hell. And he did it anyway because the alternative was screaming, and he'd be damned if he screamed in front of an audience of pine trees. The world went gray at the edges. He fought it, the way he always fought it. Some animal part of him refusing the dark even when the rest of him had started making peace with it, and through the graying he heard boots, crunching. Someone moving fast through snow, not trying to be quiet, which meant either they didn't know he was here and were making noise for some other reason, or they knew exactly where he was and didn't care if he heard them coming. He got his hand to Silver's hilt, couldn't lift the sword, managed to close his fingers around the grip anyway, because dying with a weapon in his hand was a habit 30 years in the making, and not one he intended to break today. A shape resolved out of the snow blur above him. Young. Black cloak, black leather, a long sword already half drawn like the boy had learned caution the hard way. Dark hair plastered wet against his forehead, a face that hadn't quite finished being a boy's face yet, but had already started learning what a man's face looked like when it had seen bad things. Gray eyes, narrow with suspicion, flicking over Geralt's wounds, his swords, his medallion where it had slipped free of his shirt collar and lay against his blood-soaked jerkin. "Don't move," the boy said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word, which told Geralt he was younger than he was trying to sound. "Wasn't planning on it," Geralt managed. His voice came out a rasp. "Little busy dying." The boy's sword came the rest of the way out. Behind him, further off, Geralt heard more crunching, others, several, moving with less urgency, the sound of people who hadn't yet realized something was wrong. "Who are you?" the boy demanded. "Where'd you come from?" "There's no camp within," he stopped. His eyes had found the ground around Geralt, the strange scorch mark in the snow where the tear had spat him out, blackened and smoking faintly even in the cold, utterly wrong against the white. "What is that?" "Long story," Geralt said. "Shorter one, I'm bleeding out. You going to help or just stand there with the sword looking pretty?" The boy's jaw tightened. He crouched fast, sword still in hand, but his eyes doing a different kind of work now, the work of a person assessing a wound instead of a threat. "That's a bad cut." "Astute. You're not from north of the wall." That gear, the boy's eyes had caught on Geralt's swords, the make of them, the strange steel and silver pairing no smith south or north of anywhere in this world would recognize. "You're not from anywhere I know." "You'd be right about that." Geralt's vision was starting to tunnel. Distantly, professionally, he catalogued the signs, blood loss, shock, cold compounding both, and made the closest thing to a decision his fading consciousness could manage. "Name's Geralt. If I die in the next minute, that's the only thing you need to remember. If I don't," he felt the dark reaching for him properly now, patient, certain. "Ask me the rest later." "Hey," the boy's hand caught his shoulder, shook it, and the movement was rougher than it needed to be, an act of pure animal panic dressed up as urgency. "Hey, stay awake, don't you?" The gray swallowed everything, and Geralt went under it without a fight, because there was nothing left to fight with. He surfaced slowly in pieces, the way he always did after his body had been pushed past what should have killed him. First came awareness of warmth, actual warmth, fire warmth, blanket warmth, which told him he wasn't dead, because nothing in any afterlife he'd ever heard credible witnesses describe involved wool blankets. Then came the smell, tallow smoke, old stone, boiled cabbage, and beneath it the particular mineral tang of a place that had never once, in its entire existence, been warm enough to properly air out. Then came the pain, dull and distant, a wound half-healed rather than raw, which meant time had passed and someone had done something reasonably competent with a needle and thread. He opened his eyes to a low stone ceiling, rough-hewn, lit by a single tallow candle guttering in a draft that came from everywhere and nowhere. He was in a narrow bed in a narrow room, stripped to the waist, his side bound tight in linen that smelled faintly of some herb he half recognized and mostly didn't. His swords leaned against the wall within reach, which he noted with a flicker of surprise. Someone had made a decision to trust him, or hadn't thought it through, or simply hadn't known better. His medallion still hung around his neck. Whoever had undressed him hadn't taken it, hadn't tried to pry it off, which was either ignorance or a kind of respect he hadn't expected in, wherever the hell he was. He sat up. It hurt, a bright clean line of pain along his ribs, but his body answered him the way it always did, muscle and mutated sinew doing exactly what he asked even when the rest of him would rather it didn't. The door was ajar. Beyond it, voices, low, urgent, arguing in the particular register people used when they didn't want to be arguing loudly but couldn't help the volume creeping up anyway. Can't just let a stranger with 2 swords and no name sleep in the healing wing, Jon. That's madness. We don't know what he is. I know he was bleeding out in the snow 3 miles past the wall with a wound that should have killed him twice over, Sam. I know he had a mark like a burnt star in the ground around him. I know when Maester Aemon looked at those swords, he went quiet in a way I've never seen him go quiet. And I know if I'd left him there, he'd be dead, and we'd have learned nothing. That's not an argument for keeping him alive. That's an argument for being curious, and curious gets people killed. Since when do you get to lecture me about getting people killed? You nearly pissed yourself the first time a raven looked at you funny. That is completely unrelated. Geralt swung his legs off the bed, testing them, found them steady enough, and stood. The room swayed once and then settled. He reached for his shirt, found it folded neatly on a stool. Someone had washed the blood out of it, badly, leaving a faint rust-brown stain that would never fully leave the wool, and pulled it on before the 2 voices in the corridor noticed he was awake and came to check. They did a moment later. The boy from the snow first through the door with the awkward speed of someone who'd heard the bed creak and come running, and behind him a heavier boy, softer around the middle, clutching a book to his chest like it might defend him if things went sideways. "You're awake," the first boy said, and there was something almost accusatory in it, as if Geralt's survival were a personal inconvenience he hadn't planned for. "Seems that way." Geralt looked him over properly now that his vision had stopped swimming. 16, maybe 17. Dark hair, gray eyes, the kind of face that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be handsome or simply severe. Black wool and leather, a long sword at his hip that had seen use. The wear on the grip told him that much, and beneath the wariness, a kind of tired competence that Geralt recognized because he'd worn it himself at that age in the mountain school before the world had finished carving him into what he became. "You the one who dragged me in?" "Against orders," the softer boy said with the air of someone who'd been saying it a lot and enjoyed saying it slightly too much. "The whole way back." "I want that on record." "Noted," Geralt said. "Where's here?" "Castle Black," the first boy said. "The wall. You're 3 days south of where I found you." He crossed his arms, and Geralt watched him decide visibly to stop being polite and start being useful. "My turn. What are you? Where'd you come from? What was that mark in the snow, and why does an old blind Maester go pale when he sees your swords?" Geralt considered several answers, weighed the value of lying against the value of a bed to sleep in and food that wasn't 3 days old jerky, and settled, as he usually did, on something close enough to true to hold up. "I'm a witcher," he said. "Where I'm from, that means I hunt monsters for coin. Where I'm from also isn't here. There was a tear in the world, something came through it after me, and I fell through after that. I don't know how I got to your wall specifically. I don't know how to get home yet either, but there'll be a way eventually. These things don't stay open and they don't stay shut forever." He nodded at the swords against the wall. "Steel's for men. Silver's for what isn't. If your Maester's smart enough to be scared of them without knowing why, he's smarter than most men I've met." The softer boy, Sam, the other had called him, had gone very still, the way scholars went still when they recognized they were in the presence of something that would occupy their next several years of reading. "A tear in the world," he repeated slowly, like he was trying the words on for size. Like the stories of the doom, or no, that's not." He looked at the first boy. "Jon, this is either the most extraordinary thing that's happened at this wall in 100 years, or he's mad, and I genuinely cannot tell which, and I find that thrilling and terrifying in equal measure." "He's not mad," Jon said, quietly, still watching Geralt with that assessing look, the one that hadn't fully softened even now. "Madmen don't kill drowners for coin and worry about getting home to do it again." "You believe him?" "I believe I've seen white walkers turn a man's eyes blue in the dark of the night," Jon said, and something in his voice went flat and careful when he said it, the tone of a man repeating a fact he still hadn't fully made peace with. "I'm not in a position to decide what's mad anymore." Geralt filed that away, White Walker's eyes turning blue, with the professional interest of a man whose entire life had been organized around cataloging monsters, and said nothing yet, because a fresh wound and a fever dream of a story were no foundation to build understanding on. Better to eat, heal, and listen before he started asking the questions that mattered. "Food," he said instead, "and water. I've bled out most of what I had, and whatever's in that dressing smells like it's doing its job, so whoever stitched me knows a bit of herb craft." "That was Maester Aemon," Sam said, brightening slightly at the chance to be useful in a way that didn't require deciding whether Geralt was dangerous. "He'll want to speak with you himself when you're able. He was very insistent." "Blind Maester," Geralt said. "You said." "Aye." Jon's mouth had softened just slightly at the mention of the name, the first genuine warmth Geralt had seen cross his face. "Doesn't stop him seeing more than most men with two good eyes. He'll ask about your swords." "He can ask." Geralt sat back down on the edge of the bed, more from necessity than diplomacy. His body still wanted rest more than conversation, and 30 years of witchering had taught him not to fight that particular instinct. Answers depend on whether he can keep them to himself. Where I'm from, people who know what a witcher's medallion means tend to either want to hire one or want to burn one. I'd rather this castle full of black cloaks land on the hiring side of that particular fence. "You're at a castle at the edge of the world manned by criminals, bastards, and men with nowhere else to go," Jon said, and there was a dry humor buried in it that Geralt liked immediately. An edge of self-deprecation that told him this boy had made peace, however uneasily, with his own strange place in things. "Nobody here's got the luxury of burning something useful." "Good," Geralt said, "because I'm useful, and I intend to stay that way until I find a way home." He met the Maester 2 hours later, after broth and bread had done more for his color than the healer's dressing had, in a small round room stuffed with scrolls, and the particular quiet that came from a man who'd spent decades learning to listen instead of look. Aemon Targaryen was old in the way that stone was old, not fragile so much as worn smooth by centuries of weather he'd simply refused to let break him. His eyes were milk-white and saw nothing, and yet when he turned his face toward Geralt as he entered, there was something in the set of his features that suggested he was seeing plenty. "Sit," Aemon said, before Geralt had said a word. "You favor your left side. The wound isn't fully closed, whatever miracle knit the worst of it." "Fast healer," Geralt said, sitting. "Comes with the trade. Jon tells me your trade is hunting monsters." Aemon's fingers found a cup on the table before him without hesitation, decades of blindness having taught his hands their own sight. "I have lived a very long time, Master Geralt, and I have read a very great many books, and I have never once encountered the word witcher in any of them. That troubles me less than it should. Do you know why? Enlighten me." "Because I once knew a man who claimed to have crossed the narrow sea into lands no Maester's map had ever charted, and everyone who heard him called him a liar and a drunkard, and 20 years later a merchant fleet returned from those exact waters with silks no Westerosi loom could weave." Aemon's blind eyes tracked, unerringly, toward the swords Geralt had set across his own lap. "The world is larger than the 7 kingdoms, Master Geralt. It has always been larger than the 7 kingdoms. I simply never expected to live long enough to hold proof of it in an old man's failing hands." He held out one hand, palm up, patient. Geralt considered it, then unslung the silver sword and laid it, hilt first, across the Maester's palm. Aemon's fingers traced the blade with a careful, deliberate slowness, feeling the runes etched near the guard, the particular weight and balance of a weapon designed for a purpose no Westerosi smith had ever conceived. "Silver," he said softly. "Not decoration. Functional silver in a blade meant for combat, that's absurd. Silver's too soft for a fighting edge unless—" He went very still. Unless it isn't meant for men. It isn't. What is it meant for? Things that don't like silver, wraiths, vampires, certain fae. Depends where you are and what's hunting that season. Geralt watched the old man's face carefully, cataloging the flicker of something that crossed it, not fear precisely, but recognition, the particular stillness of a man connecting dots he'd spent a lifetime refusing to connect. You said White Walkers turn men's eyes blue. Tell me about that. Aemon was quiet for a long moment, turning the sword over once more before handing it back. The wildlings call them the others. Old stories mostly, dead men rising with blue eyes and cold hands, walking when they should lie still, killing those they once loved. My brother's house considers such stories fit only for children and superstitious old women. I confess I once shared that view. His mouth twisted, something bitter in it. Jon says he's seen one, not a story, a corpse in this very castle that stood up on a table where it had lain dead for hours and tried to kill the Lord Commander before Jon put it down with fire. He killed it with fire and it stayed dead. Fire, yes. A blade did nothing. Sir Waymar Royce died trying, they say, out beyond the wall, along with the ranger he rode with. Fire is the only thing that's ever worked, so far as anyone's confirmed. Geralt turned that over slowly, the way he turned over any new monster lore, cataloging weaknesses, cross-referencing against everything he knew from 30 years of his own world's undead. Fire killing what steel couldn't wasn't unusual. Necrophages, certain wraiths, even some higher vampires shared that vulnerability. But a corpse standing up hours after death, with no visible ritual, no obvious necromancer's hand behind it, that suggested something ambient, something environmental. A place where the veil between life and death had worn thin enough that dying simply wasn't as permanent as it should be. How far, he asked, is your wall from wherever these things come from? Beyond it, always beyond it. That's rather the point of the wall, Master Geralt. 8,000 years old, they say, built to keep something out, though the Maesters south of here would tell you it was built to keep out wildling raiders and nothing more supernatural than that. 8,000 years is a long time to maintain a wall against raiders with axes. Geralt slid the silver sword back into its sheath at his hip. Where I'm from, walls that old get built against one thing. Something that doesn't die easy, and doesn't stay dead when it should. Aemon's blind eyes turned toward him again, and this time there was something almost like relief in his face, the relief of an old man who'd spent decades certain of a danger nobody else would take seriously, finally hearing someone speak of it without doubt in their voice. You believe it, he said, not as a story, as a fact you already understand the shape of. I've killed things that share the shape of what you're describing. Different names. Different world, apparently, if what's happened to me is what it looks like it is. Geralt leaned back, feeling the ache in his side settle into something more manageable. I don't know your others, but I know dead things that don't stay dead, and I know that when they start showing up more than the old stories say they should, it's usually because something's changed. Something's let more of them through or made them stronger or both. And do you know, Aemon said, very quietly, if such changes come from nothing, or do they come from somewhere? Geralt thought of the tear in the sky over the Pontar marshes, the wild hunt rider crossing through it like the world had simply stopped being able to keep its seams shut, the whole continent's mages muttering about spheres grinding closer together than they'd been in 1,000 years. He thought about a scorch mark burned into snow 3 miles past a wall that had stood for 8,000 years without, apparently, anything crossing through it from outside the world entirely. They come from somewhere, he said. I might be the reason yours just got worse. I'd like to be wrong about that. I usually am, right up until I'm not. Word of the stranger spread through Castle Black, the way word always spread through small, cold, bored garrisons, fast, exaggerated, and mostly wrong by the third telling. By the time Geralt limped out into the yard 2 days later, testing his legs properly for the first time, he'd already become, according to the whispers he half caught, a wizard from beyond the wall, a wildling king in disguise, and his personal favorite, a ghost of Sir Waymar Royce come back changed and confused about which direction was south. He ignored all of it and went looking for a training yard, because 2 days of bed rest was already 2 days too many, and a witcher's body punished idleness the same way it rewarded discipline, muscle stiffening, reflexes dulling, the mutation's careful balance drifting out of true if he let it. He found the yard easily enough, a rectangle of packed, frozen earth ringed by wooden fencing, and found Jon Snow already in it, sparring against a heavier, older recruit with a wooden practice sword, taking a beating with the kind of grim patience that told Geralt this was a regular occurrence and not a fair fight. Bastards got no business holding a sword, the recruit was saying, grinning through a gap-toothed sneer as he landed another blow across Jon's ribs. Should have stayed south with his lord father, oh wait. Jon took the hit, staggered, and came up swinging anyway. A wild overhand strike that his opponent parried easily and answered with a shove that sent Jon into the mud. Geralt watched 3 more exchanges like that, Jon absorbing punishment, giving back less than he took, the older boy clearly enjoying himself in the particular way that bullies enjoyed themselves when they'd found a target who wouldn't or couldn't fight back properly, and felt something old and familiar tighten in his chest. Not pity. He didn't do pity, hadn't for decades, had trained it out of himself the same way the trial of the grasses had trained the fear response half out of his blood. But recognition, maybe. The particular shape of a boy who'd learned to survive being hated by making himself smaller than his own anger. "You're leading with your shoulder," Geralt said, loud enough to carry across the yard. Everyone stopped. Jon, half risen from the mud, turned to look at him with an expression somewhere between embarrassment and irritation. The other recruit, broader, older, the kind of build that came from years of manual labor rather than actual training, turned too, his sneer sliding easily from Jon to Geralt. "And who's this?" the recruit said. "The wizard from beyond the wall come to give lessons." "Nah," Geralt said, walking closer. "Just a man who's watched a lot of fights. You," he nodded at the recruit, "swing from the shoulder because you're strong and you've never had to fight anyone who'd make you pay for it. Works fine against green boys, wouldn't work on much else." The recruit's face darkened. "And you'd know, would you?" "I would." Geralt stopped a few feet away, hands loose at his sides, weight settled easy and low the way 30 years of muscle memory kept it whether he thought about it or not. "Try me instead of him. See how far the shoulder swing gets you." There was a beat of silence. Jon, still half in the mud, looked between them with an expression Geralt couldn't quite read, warning maybe, or something almost like hope. The recruit laughed, short and ugly, and hefted his practice sword. "You're hurt. I heard you nearly died 3 days back." "I did." Geralt didn't move. "Doesn't change the offer." The recruit came at him the way big men who'd never been properly hurt always came at things, confident, a little sloppy, trusting size and strength to do the work that skill hadn't taught him to do. Geralt let the first swing come close enough to feel the wind of it, stepped once, sideways and down, and put the recruit on his back in the mud with a foot behind his ankle and a palm against his sternum, the whole exchange lasting perhaps a second and a half. The yard went very quiet. "Shoulder," Geralt said, standing over him, not even breathing hard despite the healing wound in his side protesting the movement. "Every time. Predictable's a death sentence in a real fight. Get up." The recruit got up, slower this time, mud-streaked and red-faced, and didn't come again. He looked at Geralt for a long moment, weighing something, and then spat into the mud near Geralt's boot and stalked off without another word, which Geralt understood well enough. Some men needed to lose in private before they could stop being cruel in public. This one might not. Not his problem either way. Jon had gotten to his feet properly now, wiping mud from his hands, watching Geralt with an expression that had shifted from wary to something more complicated. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "Didn't need to, wanted to." Geralt rolled his shoulder, feeling the wound pull and settle. "You lead with your shoulder too, by the way, just less than he does." Jon's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Everyone here fights better than me. Everyone's been fighting longer. Doesn't mean everyone's fighting smart." Geralt looked him over properly, the lean build, the reach, the particular quality of exhaustion that came from a boy carrying more weight than his shoulders were built for. Not physical weight, but the other kind, the kind that came from being unwanted in more places than he'd earned. "You want to actually learn something, or you want to keep taking beatings until the rest of them get bored of it?" Jon's eyes came up, sharp and suddenly very focused. "You teach me. I've got nothing else to do, until my way home opens back up. Might as well be useful." Geralt picked up the fallen practice sword from the mud, tossed it once to test the balance, found it acceptable. "Besides, I owe you. You're the reason I'm not a frozen corpse 3 miles past your wall. I didn't do it so you'd owe me anything." "I know." Geralt settled into a ready stance, sword low, and nodded once at Jon. "That's exactly why I'm offering. Come on. Show me what they've taught you so far. I'll tell you what's worth keeping." They sparred until the light went gray and thin, and the cold started biting through even Geralt's witcher-toughened endurance. And by the end of it, Jon was breathing hard and sweating despite the freezing air, and he'd landed exactly one clean touch on Geralt in the better part of an hour. But it was one more clean touch than the older recruit had managed in years of trying, and Geralt could see the boy cataloging that fact even as he wiped his brow and tried not to grin about it. "Again tomorrow?" Jon asked when they'd finally stopped, both of them steaming faintly in the cold. "Every day if you're serious about it." Geralt slung the practice sword back into the rack. "Fair warning. I don't go easy because you're tired or cold or feeling sorry for yourself. Where I'm from, that's how people end up dead. I don't want you to go easy." Jon said it flatly, without bravado, just a simple statement of fact, and Geralt found himself believing it entirely. "Good." He looked at the boy for a long moment, gray eyes, stubborn jaw, the particular kind of quiet that came from a person who'd learned young that nobody was coming to save him, so he'd better learn to save himself. It reminded him, uncomfortably, of another face from another lifetime, a girl with white hair and eyes too old for her years, and he pushed the thought away before it could settle somewhere it would hurt to dig out later. "Then we'll do this properly." That night, in the mess hall, over a stew that was mostly turnip and memory of meat, Sam found him again, book already open on the table, ink-stained fingers ready. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sam began without preamble, "about the tear in the world, and I wanted to ask, when it opens again to send you home, will it open in the same place? Or could it open anywhere? Because if it's tied to some manner of ley line or convergence point, there might be a pattern to predict. Don't know." Geralt spooned stew without looking up. "Never had one open on me before, not from my side of things anyway. But surely there's precedent, some school of magic on your world that's studied." "Sam." Jon, sliding onto the bench beside them with his own bowl, gave his friend a look that was half fond, half exasperated. "Let the man eat." "I can eat and answer questions," Geralt said. "Mostly. There's precedent some. Mages back home call it the conjunction. Ages back, worlds bled into each other, things crossed over that didn't belong. Elves, monsters, us eventually, or our ancestors, depending who you believe. It happened once badly, and everyone spent the centuries since making sure it didn't happen again." He shrugged, the motion pulling faintly at his healing side. "Seems it's happening again anyway. Sky was already tearing before I fell through it. I wasn't the cause, just the first thing unlucky enough to fall through the hole." "So there could be more," Sam said, eyes wide, already half writing in his head. More tears, more things crossing. B. Geralt didn't sugarcoat it, because sugarcoating things had never once made a monster smaller or a threat less real, only made the people facing it slower to react when it mattered. Might be nothing. Might be I'm the last thing to fall through before it seals for good. Won't know until I know. Jon had gone quiet, turning his spoon slowly through his stew without eating much of it, and Geralt recognized the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic on a problem he didn't like the shape of. "The Whites," Jon said finally. "They're not supposed to come this far south of the haunted forest. Not this many, not this bold. First one showed up inside the castle walls. That's never happened before, not in living memory, not even in the old stories Sam's read me." His eyes came up to meet Geralt's, sharp and direct. "You said things cross over when the world's torn. What if it's not just you that tore through? What if something's already gotten in on the other side and it's making them worse?" Geralt set his spoon down slowly. It was, he had to admit, exactly the kind of leap he'd have made himself, and hearing it come from a boy of 17 who'd known him for 2 days told him something about the boy that mattered more than any sword work in a training yard. "Could be nothing," he said again, because it was still true, and false comfort had never saved a life that honesty could have saved instead. "Could also be exactly that. I don't know your others. Don't know what feeds them, or what makes them strong or weak or scared. But if something from my world's leaking through the same tear I fell through, and it's touching whatever's beyond your wall." He thought of the wild hunt rider, frost and hunger given shape and purpose, the kind of thing that hunted across worlds precisely, because it had learned, over centuries, how to exploit exactly this sort of tear. Then your dead men walking might be about to get a great deal more interesting, and not in a way anyone here's going to enjoy. Sam had stopped writing. In the quiet that followed, the hall's other sounds, the scrape of spoons, low conversation from the far tables, the distant creak of the wall settling somewhere in its ancient bones, seemed suddenly louder, as if the world itself were listening in on a conversation it didn't much like the sound of. "Then we'd better find out," Jon said quietly, "before it does." Geralt looked at him for a long moment, this boy who dragged a bleeding stranger 3 miles through the snow against orders, who fought with more heart than skill and knew it, who'd made the same leap of logic Geralt himself would have made and hadn't flinched once at the implication. Something in his chest, old and rusted from disuse, turned over slowly and settled into a shape he recognized, uneasily, as purpose. "Aye," he said, "we'd better." Outside, the wind picked up against the wall's ancient ice, and somewhere far to the north, in the deep dark of the haunted forest, something that had slept for 8,000 years stirred, and felt, for the first time in all those centuries, a door creaking open somewhere it had no business opening at all. Chapter 2. 2 kinds of monster. Sir Alizer Thorne found him on the 4th morning, in the armory, running a whetstone along Silver's edge with the slow, meditative patience of a man who'd sharpened the same blade 10,000 times and never once found the process boring. "You're the stray Snow dragged in," Thorne said, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, taking up more space than his frame should have allowed simply by the way he held himself. He had the look of a man who'd been hard once, and had let the world sand him down into something harder and meaner, rather than letting age soften him the way it softened most people. A thin white scar ran from his temple to his jaw, and his eyes had the particular flatness of a man who'd stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. "That's me." Geralt didn't look up from the whetstone. "Master at arms here, which means every man who swings a sword in this castle answers to me, sooner or later." Thorne stepped into the room, boots ringing on stone. "You've been teaching the bastard fancy footwork in my yard. I've been teaching him what keeps a man alive." Geralt set the whetstone down finally and looked up. "Didn't realize that needed your permission." "Everything in this castle needs my permission, stranger. That's how discipline works. You don't know that yet because you're not sworn, you're not black. You're a guest who fell out of the sky with a story too strange to check and too convenient to trust. Thorne's eyes went to silver, still bare across Geralt's lap, the runes near the hilt catching the low light. Maester Aemon's taken quite a liking to you. Lord Commander's letting you eat our food and sleep in our beds on the strength of a wound, and a fever story about tears in the sky. I've fought 30 years for this watch, and I don't much care for strangers who show up out of nowhere and start reorganizing my training yard like they own it. Geralt considered several responses, weighed the political cost of each against the twitchy, wound-tight look in Thorne's shoulders, and settled on the truth, mostly because he'd found over the years that truth tended to unbalance men who were braced for lies. I don't want to own your training yard, he said. I want to get home. Until I can, I'd rather not watch a boy get his teeth kicked in every morning by a recruit twice his weight because nobody bothered teaching him how weight actually works in a fight. That's the whole of it. No grand design, no hidden angle. Everyone's got an angle. Some people don't. I know that's hard to credit in a place like this. Geralt picked the whetstone back up, resumed the slow rhythm of the stroke, deliberately unhurried, the physical language of a man who wasn't afraid and wasn't going to pretend otherwise for anyone's comfort. You want to test that theory? Put me in your yard yourself. See what angle you find. Thorne's jaw worked. Geralt watched something calculate behind those flat eyes, pride weighing against caution, the particular arithmetic of a man who'd have loved nothing more than to put an upstart stranger in the mud, and who also, somewhere in the part of his brain that had kept him alive 30 years at the edge of the world, recognized that the stranger in question had survived a wound that should have killed him twice over and hadn't so much as flinched at the offer. Another time, Thorne said, finally, which both of them understood to mean not today and possibly not ever, because I'm not certain I'd win, and I'm even less certain I want to find that out in front of my men. You watch yourself, stranger. Aemon's fondness and Mormont's curiosity only buy you so much rope. This is the night's watch. We don't take in strays because we like the company. We take them in because every sword matters when the alternative is dying alone at the edge of the world. The day you stop being useful is the day you find out exactly how much that rope's worth. Fair enough, Geralt said, and meant it, because it was, as far as philosophies of survival went, not so far removed from his own. Thorne left without another word, and Geralt went back to the whetstone, and if his hands were steadier than they had any right to be after that particular conversation, well, he'd had worse conversations with worse men in worse places, and walked away from all of them too. The training continued daily, rain or snow, or the particular gray-nothing weather that seemed to be Castle Black's default state, and within 2 weeks something in Jon Snow's fighting had changed in ways that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with how he thought. Again, Geralt said, circling him in the yard, practice sword loose in hand. You're still watching my blade instead of my shoulders. The blade's the part that kills me. The blade's the last thing that happens. Everything before it tells you it's coming if you're looking in the right place. Geralt fainted high, and Jon's eyes flicked up exactly the way they always had, and Geralt's blade came in low and touched his ribs before Jon had fully processed the mistake. There, shoulders, hips, weight on the back foot before the swing even starts. A blade's honest, Jon. It can't lie to you. Man holding it can lie all day long, but the moment he commits to a swing, his whole body's already told you the truth of it 3 heartbeats before the steel arrives. Jon straightened, rubbing his ribs, breathing hard in the cold. Frost had rimed the edges of his dark hair, and sweat steamed faintly off his neck despite the temperature, the particular exhaustion heat of a body that had been working far past what it thought its limits were. You never miss, he said. It wasn't quite an accusation, more an observation building toward a question. I've had 30 years practice at not missing. That's not what I mean. Jon set his feet again, waited for Geralt's nod before resuming his stance. I mean you don't even seem to try. Half the time you're not even looking at me properly, you're looking somewhere past me, like you're bored. Geralt considered how much to say. He'd been careful these 2 weeks about how much of the mutation he let show. The enhanced reflexes were easy enough to write off as skill, the resistance to cold as simple toughness. But there were other things, quieter things, that a sharp boy might start noticing if he watched closely enough. The way scent carried more information to Geralt than it should. The way his eyes adjusted to darkness faster than any natural thing had a right to. The way poison that would have dropped a normal man barely registered on his system at all. Where I'm from, he said, finally, Witchers aren't born, we're made. There's a process old, ugly, most who go through it don't survive it. What comes out the other side isn't quite human anymore. Faster, stronger, sees better in the dark, heals faster, doesn't age the way ordinary men age, doesn't get sick from things that kill a normal man in a week. He watched Jon's face carefully as he said it, cataloging the reaction, not fear, which surprised him slightly, but something closer to fascination, tinged with an old, familiar loneliness that Geralt recognized because he'd worn that exact expression once himself, a very long time ago, hearing his own masters describe what he was about to become. That's why the mark on the swords, Jon said, slowly putting pieces together. Witcher. It's not a name. It's what you are. Both, by now, started as a trade, turned into a species, more or less, once enough time passed and enough of the old world forgot there'd ever been another way to hunt monsters. Geralt lowered his practiced sword. Why do you ask? Jon was quiet for a long moment, looking somewhere past Geralt's shoulder, at the wall rising pale and enormous behind the training yard fence, 700 feet of ice holding back 8,000 years of something nobody south of it wanted to properly believe in. Because I've spent my whole life being told what I am before I've had the chance to decide it myself, he said. Bastard, Snow, Ned Stark's shame, even though he never once made me feel like shame, not really, not the way the rest of the world insisted on it for him. I came to the wall because I thought maybe here, finally, nobody would care what I was born as, we'd all just be black cloaks, all the same brothers. His mouth twisted, something bitter and tired in it. Turns out even here it matters. Turns out there's always a rank to it, even among men who claim to have given up everything to stand at the edge of the world. So when you talk about being made into something instead of born into it, he shrugged, a small, careful motion. I suppose I wondered what that would feel like, to choose the thing you are instead of everyone else choosing it for you. Geralt felt something shift in his chest, an old ache he'd carefully not examined in years, and thought of Ciri, the daughter he hadn't fathered but had chosen anyway, the girl he'd tried and failed and tried again to protect from a destiny everyone else insisted on writing for her whether she wanted it or not. It's not a gift, he said carefully. The choosing. Most who go through it don't get much of a choice at all. Orphans, unwanted children, sold or given to the schools because nobody wanted them anyway, and the schools were the only ones offering to take them off someone's hands. I chose it more or less, but I was a child when I chose it, too young to understand what I was agreeing to. And the process, he stopped himself, the memory of his own trial surfacing unbidden, the screaming in Kaer Morhen's cellars, the boys who never woke up, the mutagenic poison working its slow violence through a body too young to fully survive it. It nearly kills you, does kill most. What survives isn't quite the same person who went under. That's not something to want lightly, Jon. Trust me on that much. But it's still a choice, Jon said quietly. Even a hard one, even a dangerous one, that's more than I've ever had. Geralt looked at him for a long moment. this boy who'd been handed nothing but other people's decisions his whole life, who'd chosen the wall himself, and found even that choice hedged in by rank and prejudice. He hadn't fully escaped, and said nothing further, because it was too soon, far too soon, to plant a seed that dangerous in ground he hadn't yet finished testing. But he filed the conversation away carefully, the way he filed away every piece of information that might matter later, and resumed his stance across from Jon in the yard. Again, he said, watch the shoulders. The trouble that mattered came 11 days later, on a night when the wind screamed against the wall hard enough to rattle the shutters in their frames, and a ranger named Tywin came stumbling into Castle Black, half frozen and gray with terror, dragging a companion who was very obviously dead and had been for some hours, his throat torn out in a way that no wolf, no bear, and no man Tywin could name had ever managed before. Wasn't natural, Tywin kept saying over and over to anyone who'd listen, his old weathered face gone the color of ash. Wasn't no bear did that. Bears don't drain a man near dry and leave him white as milk. Wasn't whites either, I've seen whites, know their look, know they're cold. This weren't cold like that. This were, he struggled for the word, found none in his vocabulary that fit, and settled for repeating himself instead. Wasn't natural. Geralt had been in the mess hall when the commotion started, and he was on his feet and moving before he'd fully decided to, the old professional instinct that had never once needed conscious permission to activate. He found the body laid out in the yard under torchlight, Mormont already crouched beside it with Thorn at his shoulder, both men's faces set in the particular grim mask that men wore when they were trying to look like they weren't afraid in front of their subordinates. Drained, Geralt said, before anyone had asked him to weigh in, crouching to examine the wound properly. The throat wasn't just torn, it had been opened with precision, a clean puncture pattern rather than the ragged tearing a wolf or bear would leave, and the skin around the wound had gone paper-white, bloodless in a way that no simple exsanguination from a torn artery would produce. Not eaten, not mauled, drained deliberately and the body left behind because whatever did it wasn't hungry for meat. You've seen this before, Mormont said. He was an old man, gray-bearded and heavy-set, but his eyes were sharp and quick, and Geralt had noticed over the past weeks that he missed very little of what happened in his castle, even when he seemed distracted by other matters. Something like it. Not exactly. Where I'm from, there's a class of creature that feeds this way, drinks blood, leaves the body behind, hunts by night and avoids sun. Geralt straightened, looking north, toward the black tree line beyond the gate where the haunted forest began its long dark crawl toward whatever waited at the end of the world. Higher vampires, we call the smart ones. Lesser bloodsuckers otherwise. Neither should be able to survive north of your wall, if half of what I've heard about the cold up there is true. Vampires don't much like extreme cold. Slows the blood they need, dulls their senses. Then what did this? Thorn demanded. His voice had an edge Geralt recognized, not disbelief precisely, but the particular defensiveness of a man whose entire framework for understanding the world had just been handed a problem it wasn't built to solve, and who resented the messenger for it. Don't know yet. Something that shouldn't exist here, doing something it shouldn't be able to do here. That's usually a sign the rules have changed. Geralt crouched again, examined the wound more closely, and noticed, faint, easy to miss unless you'd spent 30 years learning to look for exactly this kind of thing, a residue at the wound's edge, a faint crystalline shimmer that had nothing to do with frost. He touched it with a fingertip, brought it to his nose, and the smell hit him like a slap. Ozone and rot and something colder than either, a smell he associated with a sick lurch of certainty with exactly one thing. This crossed the same way I did, he said quietly. The yard went still. Even the wind for a moment seemed to hold its breath. You're saying, Mormont said slowly, that something from your world came through with you. I'm saying something's leaking through. Might not even be the same tear I fell through, could be its own, opened somewhere in that forest without anyone noticing. The way tears in the world don't ask permission or announce themselves politely. Geralt stood, wiping his finger on his trousers, his mind already racing through catalogs of higher vampire behavior, hunting patterns, weaknesses. This is fresh. Whatever did it hasn't gone far. Vampires this newly crossed over, disoriented, hungry, they don't range wide until they've fed enough to think clearly. It'll be close. Within a night's ride, probably less. Then we hunt it, Jon said. He'd arrived at some point during the examination, unnoticed in the chaos, and now stood at the edge of the torchlight with his jaw set in a way Geralt was coming to recognize very well. You'll do no such thing, Thorn snapped. You're a boy who's been at this castle 5 months. This is watch business, and it'll be handled by rangers, not by. I found the last thing that crossed over, Jon said, and there was steel in it now, quiet but absolute. Him. I dragged him 3 miles through the snow when every part of my training said to leave him and report back. If something's crossed the same way he did, I want to be there when we find it. Enough! Mormont's voice cut through both of them, flat with authority. He looked at Geralt for a long, measuring moment. You know this creature, you've killed things like it before. Many times. Then you'll come. And you, his eyes shifted to Jon, and will come with him, since apparently you've appointed yourself his shadow whether anyone's asked you to or not. Thorn, pick 4 rangers, good ones, men who won't panic at something they don't recognize. We ride at first light. Lord Commander, with respect, Thorn began. I've given the order, Alizer. Mormont's voice hadn't risen, but something in it had gone hard as the wall itself. A man's dead and drained white in my own yard. I want it found, and I want it dead before it does that to a second man. And this stranger's the only person within 1,000 miles who's ever hunted its kind and lived to describe it. That's not a comfortable fact. It's simply a true one. Deal with it. Thorn's mouth tightened into a thin white line, but he said nothing further, and Geralt watched him stalk off into the dark, with the particular contained fury of a man who just watched his own authority quietly overruled in front of the men he commanded. A wound to pride that Geralt suspected would fester longer than any physical injury might have. They rode out at first light. 6 of them, Geralt, Jon, Mormont himself, despite his age and the grumbling of half the yard about a Lord Commander riding out on a hunt he had no business personally attending, and 3 rangers Thorn had grudgingly selected, grim, weathered men who eyed Geralt's swords with a mixture of suspicion and hope that suggested they'd rather trust a stranger's strange steel than face whatever waited in the haunted forest with nothing but their own steel and superstition. The forest, when they reached it, was exactly as unsettling as its name suggested, ancient, dense. The trees close enough together that sunlight barely made it to the forest floor even at midday, and a silence hanging over the place that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with a wrongness the local wildlife had apparently decided to avoid entirely. No bird song, no rustle of small game in the underbrush. Just wind moving through branches that seemed, subtly, to lean the wrong way, as if the whole forest had been planted by something that didn't quite understand how trees were supposed to grow. You feel that? Geralt asked Jon quietly as they walked their horses deeper along the trail Tywin had marked. Feel what? Wrongness. In the air. Like something's pulling at the edges of the world here, thinner than it should be. Geralt's medallion, hanging beneath his shirt, had begun to hum faintly against his chest. Not violently, not the way it did near active dark magic, but a low, steady vibration that told him something unnatural had recently passed through this stretch of woods and hadn't fully finished passing through yet. That's the tear, or what's left after something's already come through it. Jon's brow furrowed, and he was quiet for a long moment, head tilted slightly as if listening for something beneath the wind. "I don't feel anything," he said finally, sounding almost apologetic about it. "You wouldn't. Not yet." Geralt didn't elaborate, and Jon, to his credit, didn't push, though the not yet clearly registered and clearly lodged somewhere Geralt suspected would surface again later, in a quieter conversation, when the boy had time to turn the words over properly. They found the creature's trail an hour before dusk. A thin, dark ichor spattered across snow in a pattern Geralt recognized immediately. The discarded husk of prey the thing had fed on and abandoned once it had drained what it needed. A second body. This 1 week older than the first, half buried and mostly consumed by scavengers that had apparently decided. Unlike the local birds, that dead meat was still dead meat regardless of what killed it. "Wildling," one of the rangers said grimly, crouching over the remains. "Free folk hunter by the look of the boots, been dead longer than the fellow that came in last night." "Which means our friend's been feeding a while," Geralt said. "Getting stronger, getting bolder." He straightened, scanning the tree line, every instinct honed by 3 decades of hunting, screaming that they were being watched, had probably been watched for the last half-mile at least. "It'll have found somewhere dark to den during daylight. Caves if there are any clothes, old ruins, anywhere the sun can't reach properly. There's an old wildling watchtower half a mile north," one of the other rangers offered. "Abandoned generations back. Half collapsed, but there's a cellar beneath it that never did get properly filled in. That'll be it." Geralt swung back up onto his horse. "We go now before full dark. Vampires this newly crossed are dangerous but disoriented. Give it a few more feedings, a few more nights to adjust to this world's rules, and it'll be smart enough to be genuinely difficult. Right now it's still hunting like an animal instead of thinking like a predator. That's our advantage. Won't last." Mormont nodded once, sharp and decisive despite his age, and they rode. The watchtower, when they reached it, was every bit the ruin the ranger had described. Stone walls half collapsed under centuries of weather. The roof long gone, black open windows staring out over the surrounding forest like empty eye sockets. The cellar entrance yawned dark at the base of the tower's remaining wall, steps leading down into a blackness that seemed to actively resist the last dying light of the afternoon sun. "I go first," Geralt said, dismounting. "Alone." "Not a chance," Jon said immediately. "Jon, you said it yourself, you don't know exactly what's crossed over, don't know how it's changed being here instead of wherever it came from. That's not a reason to go in alone. That's a reason to have someone at your back who's already seen what a crossed-over thing looks like up close." Jon had already dismounted too, drawing his longsword, and there was something in his stance, steady, decisive, no trace of the hesitation Geralt remembered from that first sparring match weeks ago, that told Geralt arguing further would waste time neither of them had. "Fine." Geralt drew both swords, steel in his left hand, silver in his right. "Stay behind me. Don't look it in the eyes if it's a higher one. Some can pull at a man's will if he meets its gaze too long. And if I tell you to run, you run, no arguing, no heroics. Understood?" "Understood." Jon's voice didn't waver. Mormont moved to follow as well, but Geralt held up a hand. "You're needed out here, Lord Commander. If this goes wrong, someone needs to be alive to tell the wall what killed us so the next hunter knows better." It wasn't flattery. Geralt genuinely believed it, and Mormont, after a long, measuring look, nodded and stayed put with the 3 rangers fanning out to cover the tower's exits instead. The cellar swallowed the light almost immediately past the top step. Geralt's eyes adjusted faster than a normal man's would have. The mutation doing its quiet, reliable work, resolving shapes out of the dark that would have been invisible to Jon behind him. Old crates, rotted and collapsed, the bones of something long dead in one corner. And at the far end of the room, in the deepest shadow, a shape that unfolded itself from stillness with the fluid, unnatural grace of something that had never once needed to move like prey. It was tall, taller than any man had a right to be, its limbs too long, its proportions subtly, sickeningly wrong in the way that told Geralt immediately this wasn't quite a higher vampire in the classical sense. Not fully, but something that had crossed the tier only partway transformed, caught between whatever it had been and whatever the crossing had turned it into. Its skin had the pale, waxen quality of the drowned, and its eyes, when they opened, glowed a faint, sickly blue that made Geralt's blood go cold with a recognition he hadn't expected and didn't much like. That's not vampire blue, he thought grimly. That's the same blue Aemon described. Jon, he said, low and urgent. That eye color. That's what they look like. Jon breathed from behind him, his voice gone tight. That's exactly what they look like. The thing lunged. It moved faster than anything with those proportions should have been able to move, closing the distance in a single fluid burst that would have taken a normal man's head clean off if Geralt hadn't already been moving, steel coming up to deflect the first raking claw strike while silver swept in low and caught the creature across the ribs. It screamed, a sound like tearing metal, nothing vocal in it at all, and the silver wound smoked where it had struck, black ichor hissing and steaming as if the metal itself were poison to whatever this thing had become. Good, Geralt thought, grimly satisfied even as he retreated a step to reset his stance. Silver still works. Whatever crossed over, it kept that vulnerability at least. The creature came again, faster this time, and Geralt met it blade to claw, steel screaming against something harder than bone, and behind him he heard Jon's boots shift, positioning, and then the boy's voice, sharp and clear. Left. It's circling left. Geralt adjusted without thinking, trusting the warning absolutely, and the pivot saved him from a strike that would have opened his back. The creature had indeed circled, using the dark and its own unnatural speed to try to flank him, and Jon had caught the movement in the shadows that Geralt's own attention, fixed forward on the primary threat, had missed by a fraction of a second. Nice catch, Geralt said, and drove Silver forward in a straight thrust that caught the creature through what would have been, in a normal man, the sternum. It didn't die. It staggered, screeching, black ichor pouring from the wound, but it didn't fall, and Geralt understood with sudden, cold clarity that this thing had crossed over, changed in ways that made his usual assumptions dangerous. Whatever vulnerability a higher vampire from his world would have had to a heartstrike, this hybrid thing, half a world's monster and half whatever ambient wrongness haunted these woods, simply didn't share. Fire, he snapped. Jon, if you've got a torch. Jon didn't have a torch, but he had the presence of mind in the half-second Geralt gave him to grab a length of rotted, oil-soaked crate wood from the floor and shove it into the small campfire. The creature had apparently been keeping in one corner, evidence, grim and telling, that whatever this thing had once been, some fragment of intelligence, of habit, of memory, had survived the crossing along with the hunger. The improvised torch caught fast, oil-soaked wood flaring bright in the dark cellar, and Jon drove it forward without hesitation into the creature's exposed wound, the moment Geralt's silver blade opened a second gap in its flank. The scream that followed was worse than the first, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere other than the creature's throat entirely, and this time when it staggered, it didn't recover. Fire licked up along the ichor-soaked wound, spreading faster than any natural flame should have, consuming the creature from the inside in a way that told Geralt everything he needed to know about how deeply this hybrid horror belonged, ultimately, to the world it had crossed into rather than the one it had come from. It collapsed into ash and steaming ichor within a dozen heartbeats, and the cellar went silent except for the crackle of the dying flame and both men's ragged breathing. "You're bleeding," Jon said after a moment, nodding at Geralt's forearm where a claw had caught him during the first exchange. "Barely." Geralt examined the shallow gash, judged it unimportant, and sheathed both swords. You did well, better than well. That catch on the flank, if you hadn't called it, that thing would have had my spine. I just saw the shadow move wrong. Jon was still breathing hard, adrenaline clearly working through his system, but there was something steady underneath it, something that hadn't been there in quite that measure 2 weeks ago. You said watch shoulders and hips. Guess I've been listening. Guess you have. Geralt looked at the ash and ichor cooling on the stone floor and then at Jon's face, flushed and alive in the dying firelight, and felt that same old ache stir again, the one he'd been carefully not naming for 2 weeks now. That eye color. You said that's what your others look like. Jon's expression sobered instantly. Exactly like that, down to the shade of it. Then whatever's crossing through that tear isn't just adding new monsters to your world, Geralt said, slowly, working through the implication as he spoke it aloud. It might be feeding something that was already here, making it stronger. Or he stopped, a colder thought surfacing, or your others were always partly this, partly something from beyond, and my world's just given them a fresh vein to draw on. That's not a comforting thought. No, Geralt agreed. It isn't. They climbed back up into the dying light together, and Mormont's face, when he saw them emerge unharmed with news of the thing's death, went through relief and grim satisfaction in quick succession, before settling into something more thoughtful, more calculating. The look of a commander already turning a single victory into a longer strategy. "You'll want to speak with the Maester again," Mormont said, once the Rangers had begun the ride back and the two of them walked their horses a little apart from the group. "And with me, properly, in private. If what's beyond the wall is drawing strength from wherever you fell from, Master Geralt, then you're not simply a guest recovering from a wound anymore. You're the only man alive who understands what we're truly facing." "I'm one man," Geralt said, "good with a sword, not an army." Number, Mormont's eyes cut sideways to Jon, riding a few lengths ahead, straight-backed and alert despite the exhaustion clearly settling into his shoulders after the fight. "But you've been training that boy for 2 weeks, and I've watched him in that time learn more than most recruits manage in 2 years. I don't know what you are, exactly, or what your world's methods might do to a man of mine. But I know an opportunity when the wall hands me one, and I've buried too many good Rangers not to consider every option that might keep the next generation of them alive." Geralt said nothing, but the words settled into him like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward toward a decision he hadn't yet let himself fully consider. That night back at Castle Black, he sat alone by the fire in the small chamber they'd given him, turning silver over in his hands, watching firelight catch along the runes near the hilt, and thought about blue eyes glowing in a dark cellar, and a boy who'd called out a flanking maneuver half a heartbeat before it would have mattered, and a whole world, 2 worlds now, tangled together by a tear that showed no sign of closing. Waiting on the other side of a decision he wasn't at all certain he had the right to make for anyone but himself. Chapter 3. The Trial of the Wall. 3 weeks after the thing in the watchtower cellar burned to ash, Geralt found himself standing at the edge of the rookery tower roof at midnight, looking north at a sky gone strange, not the healthy black and silver of stars doing what stars had always done, but something faintly, wrongly green at the edges, a bruised color bleeding along the horizon where the aurora should have been. His medallion hummed against his chest, steady now, not the occasional flicker it had been that first week, but a constant low vibration, like a second heartbeat that wasn't quite his own. It hadn't stopped humming in 9 days. He'd learned over 30 years what that particular constancy meant, and he didn't much like the answer. The tear wasn't closing. It was widening. "Couldn't sleep either," Sam said, climbing the last few rungs of the ladder with the particular graceless effort of a young man who'd never much cared for heights or exertion but had decided, some weeks back, That proximity to Geralt was worth both. He'd brought a book, because Sam brought a book to nearly everything. Tucked under one arm along with an ink pot, he'd apparently decided not to risk spilling on the climb. Maester Aemon says the sky's been like that for a fortnight now. He says in 80 years he's never seen anything describe it in any record he's read, not even the oldest ones from the Age of Heroes. It's not going to close on its own, Geralt said. Not soon anyway. Whatever tore, it's still tearing, getting wider, not narrower. Sam absorbed that with the particular stillness of a scholar filing away a fact that terrified him precisely because he understood its implications faster than most men would have. You mean you're stuck here? Properly stuck? Not just waiting. I mean I don't know how long I'm stuck, and neither does anyone on either side of it, and that's worse than knowing for certain. Geralt kept his eyes on the northern horizon, on that faint sick green smear against the stars. And I mean whatever's on the other side of that tier, in your haunted forest. It's had 9 days now of a wider door than it had before. That thing we burned in the cellar was one creature that slipped through partway. I don't much like guessing what a wider door lets through whole. You think there'll be more of them, things like the cellar creature. I think there's already more of them, and we just haven't found the bodies yet. Geralt finally looked away from the sky, down at Sam's earnest, worried face. How's the research coming? Sam brightened slightly, the particular brightening of a man handed a task that let him feel useful without requiring him to hold a sword. Slowly. Maester Aemon's let me into the deepest archive, the one even most of the Maesters who have served here never bother with, records going back centuries, most of them in old High Valyrian or older tongues besides, half-rotted, barely legible. I've found 3 mentions of crossings or tiers in the sky in old wildling oral histories that were transcribed maybe 200 years back, always tied to periods when the whites grew bolder, came further south than usual. I've found one account from nearly 1,000 years ago of a star that fell and did not burn, might be nothing, might be a meteor, but the description of it landing without heat, without impact crater just arriving. He shrugged, helpless. It fits the pattern you're describing better than it fits any pattern I understand. So this has happened before. I think it might have. I think, Sam hesitated, the particular hesitation of a man about to say something he wasn't fully certain he believed yet himself. I think the wall might not just be a wall against the others. I wonder if it's also, in some way nobody's remembered properly in 8,000 years, a wall against exactly this. Against tiers. Against things crossing through from wherever you're from. Geralt turned that over slowly. It fit, in the ugly, elegant way that true things tended to fit, once you stopped forcing them into the shape you wanted, and let them settle into the shape they actually were. 8,000 years of ice, 700 feet of it warded. Aemon had mentioned wards, old ones half forgotten, against something that came from beyond the world entirely, not merely beyond the border of one kingdom's map. If that's true, Geralt said, then whatever built this wall knew things your Maesters have spent centuries forgetting. And whatever's cracking now, out past that ice, isn't just the others waking up early. It's the ward itself failing. Which means the wall's not just under threat. It might be the actual barrier keeping my world's monsters and yours from finishing the job of merging into one very ugly mess. Sam had gone quite pale in the moonlight. That's an enormous amount of responsibility for one very old, very cold wall. Most important things usually are older and colder than anyone wants them to be. Geralt looked back north, one more time, at that faint sick green smear against the stars, and made a decision he'd been circling for 3 weeks without quite letting himself land on it. Sam, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about the answer before you give it to me, because it matters more than you're going to want it to. All right. Sam's voice had gone careful. Where I'm from, when we make a witcher when the trial happens, it requires certain ingredients. Herbs, minerals, some of them alchemical compounds that don't exist naturally. They have to be prepared just so. I lost most of what I was carrying when I fell through the tier. What's left is enough for maybe one attempt. Maybe. I've been going through what herb lore your Maester keeps, cross-referencing, and some of what grows wild in these mountains, and even in that cursed forest of yours might substitute for what I lost, if prepared right. He watched Sam's face carefully. I want your help identifying and gathering it, quietly, without anyone but Aemon knowing why not yet. Sam's mouth had gone slightly open. You mean to try it here, the trial on someone? I mean I'm considering it, haven't decided. Might never decide if the ingredients aren't right, or if the one person I'm considering has the sense to tell me number. Geralt's jaw tightened. I've watched boys die from this trial in the best conditions my own world could provide, proper alchemists, proper facilities, centuries of refined technique, and it still kills more than half who attempt it. Doing it here with substitute ingredients and none of the safeguards, the odds get worse. Maybe a lot worse. I won't lie about that to anyone, least of all to whoever I'm asking. Jon, Sam said quietly. It wasn't a question. Jon, Geralt confirmed. Sam was silent for a long moment, looking out at the same stretch of sky Geralt had been watching, his round face uncharacteristically still. He'd say yes, he said finally. You know that already, don't you? If you asked him tonight, right now, he'd say yes before you finished explaining the risk. I know. Geralt's voice had gone rough. That's exactly why I haven't asked him yet. He asked him 4 days later, in the empty training yard at dawn. Frost still silvering the ground and neither of them yet fully awake. Because Geralt had found over the years that important conversations went better when both parties were slightly too tired to perform for each other, and simply said what was true instead. I want to tell you about something, he said. And I want you to hear the whole of it before you say a single word back, because I know you, and I know you'll want to say yes before I've finished the sentence, and that's exactly the wrong way to decide this. Jon set down the practice sword he'd been idly turning through warm-up drills, and something in his face went very still, very focused, the particular stillness of a young man who understood, instinctively, that whatever came next mattered more than the morning's usual sparring. Geralt told him. All of it, the trial of the grasses, the mutagens, the screaming boys in Kaer Morhen cellars whose names he still remembered 30 years later, the mortality rate that hovered somewhere around 40 in every 100, the way the process rewired a body's blood and organs and nervous system, until what walked out the other side, if anything walked out at all, was faster and stronger and colder-blooded in ways that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with biology. He told him about the substitute ingredients, the uncertainty of them, the very real possibility that using unfamiliar herbs in place of the original mutagens might not just fail to work but might actively make the dying worse, slower, more painful. He told him at the end, flatly and without softening it, that he did not know, could not know, had no way of knowing whether Jon's body, Westerosi rather than continent-born, would even respond to the process the same way at all, whether it might reject the mutagens entirely, whether it might do something neither of them could predict. Jon listened to all of it without interrupting once, his face gone gradually paler as the details accumulated, and when Geralt finally finished, the silence between them stretched long enough that a raven somewhere on the rookery tower had time to call twice before either of them spoke. What do I get? Jon said, finally, if it works. Faster reflexes than any man alive on either side of your wall. Strength beyond what your frame should be able to produce. Resistance to poison, to cold, to disease. Better eyes in the dark than an owl's. A body that heals in days what would take a normal man weeks, and ages, eventually, at maybe a third the rate a normal man's does. And Geralt hesitated, because this part mattered more than the rest and he wanted Jon to understand that clearly. A medallion, if I can salvage or fashion something close enough to one, it reacts to magic, to the unnatural. Your whites, your others, whatever crosses through that tier, if it's touched by anything that isn't simply flesh and blood the way the world's supposed to make it, the medallion will tell you before your eyes do. That's not a small thing up here. That might be the difference between walking into an ambush and walking around one. And if it doesn't work, then you die, possibly quickly, possibly not. Geralt made himself say the next part without flinching, because Jon deserved the truth delivered plainly, not softened into something easier to swallow. I've seen boys take 3 days to die from a failed trial, screaming most of it. I won't pretend that's a kind death, and I won't pretend I can promise you anything gentler if it goes wrong here, with ingredients I've never used this way before. Jon was quiet again, but this time Geralt watched him actually think it through rather than simply absorb the shock of it, watched his eyes go distant, turned inward, weighing something that clearly went beyond simple fear. "Why me?" Jon asked, eventually. "You could ask anyone in this castle. Gren's stronger than I am, Pip's faster on his feet. Why come to me with something this dangerous?" Geralt had turned that question over himself in the quiet hours before dawn, and found an answer he was fairly certain was true even if it wasn't entirely comfortable to say aloud. Because Gren and Pip have a place here already. Rough one maybe, but a place, brothers who don't much care where they came from, a purpose they've settled into. You don't. You've spent your whole life being told what you are by other people, and every place you've stood, someone's found a reason to remind you that you don't quite belong there. I've watched you fight these last 5 weeks, not just with a sword, with everything. You fight like a man who's used to proving himself to people who have already decided the verdict before the trial starts. He held Jon's gaze steadily. "I'm not offering you power because I think you need saving, Jon. I'm offering it because I think you're the one person in this castle who'd actually choose it, properly choose it, eyes open, understanding the cost, instead of just wanting it handed to you because it sounds like an escape from something. There's a difference, and it matters more than you'd think. And if I say no, then you say no, and we never speak of it again, and I'll go on teaching you sword work the ordinary way for however long I'm stuck in this world, and you'll still be the best swordsman this castle's produced in a decade regardless." Geralt meant every word of it. "This isn't a test you fail by refusing it. I'd think less of you for saying yes carelessly than I would for saying no carefully." Jon looked past him north, toward the wall rising pale and vast against the gray morning sky. 700 feet of ice holding back 8,000 years of something the whole realm had spent generations convincing itself was only a story. "The whites are getting bolder," he said quietly. "You said it yourself. Whatever's crossed with you, it's feeding something that was already here, making it worse. And I've stood in that yard and watched a dead man's blue eyes try to kill the Lord Commander, and I've read every account Sam could dig up, and none of it gets better on its own. It only gets worse, the longer we wait to understand what we're actually facing." He turned back to Geralt, and his jaw had that set to it now, the one Geralt had come to recognize as the boy making a decision he'd already half-made days ago, and was only now admitting to himself. "I don't want this because I think it'll fix what people think of me. I've made peace mostly with being the bastard nobody quite trusts. I want it because someone's going to have to stand at the front of whatever's coming, and I'd rather be able to actually do something when it arrives than die proving I was brave and useless in equal measure. That's not the same as wanting power for its own sake," Geralt said quietly. "That's the difference I was talking about." "Then the answer's yes." Jon's voice didn't waver. "When?" "Not yet." Geralt held up a hand before the boy's obvious eagerness could run ahead of the practical matters still standing in the way. I need the ingredients gathered and prepared properly first. That's weeks of work, not days, and rushing it kills people faster than doing it right. I need Aemon's help with what herb lore he's got and Sam's for the research. And I need you stronger than you are now, physically. The body that goes into the trial matters. The stronger and more resilient going in, the better the odds coming out. So we keep training, harder than before. And we wait until everything's as ready as I can make it. Because I am not going to rush this and watch you die from my impatience instead of the process itself. Jon nodded, slow and solemn, and something passed between them in that moment that Geralt recognized, with a faint ache, as the particular weight of trust given without reservation. The kind of trust he hadn't earned from anyone in a very long time, and hadn't fully realized until just now how much he'd missed carrying it. Word reached Thorne within the week, because word reached Thorne about everything eventually, and he found Geralt in the armory again. This time with none of the careful, testing hostility of their first conversation and all of the open, unguarded fury of a man who decided the time for careful had passed. "You mean to poison him," Thorne said without preamble, slamming the armory door hard enough that dust sifted down from the rafters. "That's what I'm hearing. Some manner of ritual, alchemy. You mean to feed the boy poison and see if he lives through it in my own castle without so much as consulting me or the Lord Commander properly?" "Mormont knows," Geralt said evenly, not looking up from the leather strap he was mending. "Aemon knows. Sam knows, and he's been the one helping gather what's needed. This isn't a secret you've stumbled onto, Sir Alizer. It's simply not information you were owed first." "Not owed." Thorne's voice cracked with the effort of keeping it from becoming a shout. "I am master at arms of this castle. Every man who trains, who fights, who bleeds under my command, I am owed the knowledge of what's happening to him. You'd turn Ned Stark's bastard into some manner of creature, and you didn't think that warranted my involvement. He's not a boy under your command in this. He's a man who made his own choice about his own body, with the full truth of the risk laid out plainly in front of him." Geralt set the strap down and finally looked up, meeting Thorne's furious glare without flinching. "That's more than most men in this world ever get to say about anything that happens to them. And if he dies, if your poison kills him screaming in some cellar, what then? Do I tell his brothers in the Watch that a stranger who fell out of the sky experimented on him with foreign alchemy and it simply didn't take? Do I tell Lord Stark, wherever he is, that his bastard died as some manner of trial subject for a man none of us understand and none of us can properly vouch for?" The words landed harder than Thorne probably intended, or perhaps exactly as hard as he intended, and Geralt felt something old and cold settle behind his eyes, the particular flatness that came over him when a conversation had stopped being about persuasion and started being about something closer to a threat. "You think I haven't already sat with that exact possibility?" Geralt said, quietly, "every night since Jon said yes." Thorne's fury faltered slightly, caught off guard by the lack of defensiveness in the answer. "You think," Geralt went on, "that I offered this lightly, that I haven't spent 30 years watching boys die from this exact process, back where I'm from, boys I trained alongside, boys whose screams I still hear some nights when the wind's wrong. I'm not doing this because I think it's a game, Sir Alizer. I'm doing it because your wall is failing, your dead men are getting stronger, and something's crossing through a tier in the world that's getting wider every single day. And I would rather give this castle one more sword capable of actually fighting what's coming than watch every good man here die brave and unprepared when it finally arrives in force. That's the whole of my reasoning. If you've got a better plan for surviving what's coming, I'm genuinely willing to hear it." Thorne was silent for a long moment, his jaw working, and Geralt watched something complicated cross the man's weathered face. Not quite doubt, not quite agreement, but something adjacent to both. The particular discomfort of a man who'd built his entire understanding of the world around discipline and hierarchy and hard-won experience, now confronted with a problem that none of those tools were built to solve. "I've buried more brothers at this wall than you've likely met people in your entire life," Thorn said, finally, his voice gone low and rough. "I don't fear death, stranger. I fear what a man becomes when he's not properly a man anymore. I've seen what magic does to people, out beyond that wall, in the stories the old wildlings still tell around their fires. Men turn to horrors, men who lose themselves entirely to whatever's remade them. You tell me Jon Snow will come out the other side of your ritual faster, stronger, better suited to fight. I ask you, will he still be Jon Snow when he does? Or will he be something wearing his face, something that used to care about this castle and these men, before you finished carving him into whatever you needed him to be?" It was, Geralt had to admit, a fair question, fairer than he wanted it to be, coming from a man he'd otherwise have been content to dismiss as simple pride and prejudice. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Nobody's ever done exactly what I'm about to try. I believe he'll still be himself. Every Witcher I've ever known kept the core of who they were before the trial. The mutation changes the body, sharpens the mind. Sometimes it dulls certain feelings that would get in the way of survival. But it doesn't erase a person. It refines what's already there. If Jon goes in stubborn and decent and too hard on himself, he'll come out stubborn and decent and too hard on himself, only faster and harder to kill while he's being all three." Geralt held Thorn's gaze. "But I can't promise you certainty, because there isn't any to give. All I can promise is that I'll be there through every hour of it, doing everything in my power to bring him out the other side whole. That's not nothing. It's just not everything you're asking for either." Thorn said nothing further. He turned and left the armory without another word, and Geralt watched him go with the uncomfortable sense that he hadn't won the argument so much as simply exhausted it, and that Thorn's opposition hadn't ended so much as gone underground, waiting for a better moment to resurface. The trial began on a night chosen deliberately for its stillness. No wind, no storm. The sky clear enough that even the faint sickly green bruise along the horizon seemed muted, distant, as if the world itself had decided to hold its breath for what was about to happen in an abandoned storeroom beneath Castle Black's oldest tower. Aemon had insisted on the location, deep, cool, stable in temperature, far enough from the general quarters that screaming, if there was screaming, wouldn't carry to frighten the rest of the garrison unnecessarily. Sam had spent 2 days simply cleaning it, scrubbing decades of dust and grime from stone that hadn't seen proper use in generations, laying out clean linens and boiled water, and the small collection of instruments Geralt would need. Mormont had come once, briefly, the evening before, and said nothing of substance to Jon beyond a single hand on the boy's shoulder and the words, "Whatever you become, you'll always be a man of the Night's Watch first," which Geralt had watched land on Jon with more visible impact than anything else said to him in the preceding weeks. Now, in the flickering light of a dozen candles and one small brazier kept low for warmth, Jon lay stripped to the waist on a table Sam had padded as best he could with folded blankets, and Geralt stood over the mutagenic mixture he'd spent 3 weeks refining, checking its color and consistency one final time with the particular obsessive care of a man who understood, better than anyone alive in this world, exactly how much could go wrong in the next several hours. "Talk to me," Jon said, his voice steadier than his slightly too fast breathing suggested he actually felt. "Tell me what happens, all of it. I don't want to be surprised. First, you drink this." Geralt held up the small clay vessel, its contents a dark, viscous green that smelled, even from a foot away, of things that had never been meant to be mixed together. It'll taste worse than anything you've ever put in your mouth. That's not an exaggeration for effect. Within a few minutes, your heart rate will spike, feel like it's trying to climb out of your chest. That's expected. Don't fight it, don't try to slow your breathing to compensate, just let it happen. And then it gets worse before it gets better, if it gets better at all. Geralt kept his voice level, deliberately flat, because false comfort had never once made a hard truth easier to survive. Your body's going to fight what's happening to it. That's the mutagens doing their work, breaking down what's there, rebuilding it into something that can handle the rest of the process. There'll be pain. I won't lie to you about the scale of it. Some who go through this describe it as feeling like every bone in their body is being reshaped at once, because in a sense, that's exactly what's happening. It can last hours. In the worst cases I've witnessed, most of a full day. Sam, standing near the door with a bowl of clean water and a stack of linens, had gone the color of old parchment, but he didn't leave, didn't so much as shift his weight. And Geralt filed that away with a flicker of genuine respect. The boy was terrified and staying anyway, which was its own particular kind of courage that had nothing to do with swords. If your body accepts the mutagens, Geralt continued, you'll come through the worst of it into something like sleep, deep, difficult to wake from but stable. That's the sign it's working. If your body rejects them, he hesitated, just slightly, the only outward sign of how much this next part cost him to say plainly. Then the pain doesn't taper off. It gets worse, and your body starts failing in ways I'll be able to see and try to manage, but that I can't promise to fix. I have herbs prepared to ease that if it comes to it. I won't let you suffer longer than I can help, Jon. That much I can promise you absolutely. Jon was quiet for a moment, staring up at the low stone ceiling, and when he spoke again his voice had gone soft, almost private, the kind of voice a man used when he'd stopped performing courage for an audience and simply admitted the plain truth of what he felt. "I'm afraid," he said. "Good," Geralt said. "Man who isn't afraid of this hasn't understood what I've told him. Fear's not the problem, Jon. Fear that stops you from choosing what's right, that's the problem. You've chosen already. The fear doesn't undo the choice. It just means you're taking it seriously the way it deserves." Jon's breath went out slow and steady, some tension easing fractionally from his shoulders, and he nodded once, sharp and final. "Then let's do it before I lose my nerve entirely." Geralt handed him the vessel. Jon took it in both hands, looked at it for one long moment, the last moment, Geralt understood, in which Jon Snow would still be entirely and only what he'd been born, and drank it down in 3 long swallows, grimacing violently at the taste but not stopping until it was empty. For nearly a minute, nothing happened at all. Then Jon's back arched off the table, a sound tearing out of him that was half gasp and half strangled cry, and his hands clenched so hard into the padded blankets that his knuckles went white. And Geralt was already moving, one hand pressing firm against the boy's shoulder to keep him from thrashing off the table entirely, while his other hand checked the pulse hammering wild and frantic at his throat. "That's it," Geralt said, low and steady, the voice he'd learned decades ago to use in exactly this moment, the voice meant to anchor a drowning man to something solid even when nothing else in the world felt solid at all. "That's the mutagens taking hold. Breathe through it if you can. You're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing." Jon's breathing had gone ragged, fast and shallow, sweat already beading thick along his hairline despite the storeroom's chill, and his eyes, when they opened, had gone wide and glassy, the pupils blown so wide the gray of his irises had nearly disappeared entirely. It's inside," Jon managed through gritted teeth. "It's moving, I know." Geralt kept his grip firm on the boy's shoulder. "It's supposed to. Let it." The next hour passed in a blur of small, brutal escalations. Jon's fever climbing hot enough that Sam, following Geralt's clipped instructions, kept cool water pressed constantly to his forehead and throat, Jon's muscles seizing in long, rolling waves that left him gasping and rigid, then suddenly slack, then rigid again. A moment, 20 minutes in, when Jon's heart stuttered and stopped entirely for 4 full seconds that felt to Geralt like 4 full years, before it lurched back into a rhythm faster and stranger than any normal man's pulse had any business being. "That's it," Geralt said when the pulse steadied, relief cutting through his own carefully maintained calm for the first time since the process began. "That's the heart adapting. It's going to run faster than it used to permanently once this is done. That's normal. That's supposed to happen." "Supposed to," Sam repeated weakly from where he knelt beside the table, "doesn't make it look any less terrifying if you don't mind my saying so." "Didn't say it wasn't terrifying. Said it was supposed to happen." Geralt didn't look up from checking Jon's eyes, pupils still blown wide but the glassy quality shifting now into something sharper, more focused, even through the pain visibly racking the boy's body. "There's a difference. Terror I can work with. Surprise gets people killed." 2 hours in, Jon began to speak, not coherently, not at first, fragments surfacing and dissolving through the fever like debris churned up from some deep riverbed. His father's name twice. Something about a sword. A woman's name Geralt didn't recognize, Ygritte, though he wouldn't learn the significance of that particular name for some months yet. And once clearly enough that both Geralt and Sam went still to hear it, the single word Rob, spoken with a grief so raw and immediate that it seemed to belong to some wound that had never properly closed at all. "He's dreaming," Sam whispered, "or remembering, or both. Could be both." Geralt kept his hand steady on Jon's shoulder, a physical anchor through whatever storm was moving through the boy's mind alongside the one moving through his body. The mutagens don't just rework the body. They can surface things, old grief, old fear, whatever's been buried and not properly dealt with. Best thing you can do for him right now is exactly what you've been doing. Stay close. Let him hear a voice he trusts, even if he can't fully process the words. Sam swallowed hard, and then, haltingly, began to talk, about nothing important, about the library, about a particular passage in an old book he'd been reading about the history of House Stark, his voice trembling but steady, a lifeline of ordinary words thrown across whatever gulf Jon's mind was currently drowning in. Geralt watched Jon's ragged breathing slow, fractionally, in response, and felt a fresh wave of respect for the soft, frightened boy who'd nonetheless found exactly the right thing to offer without anyone telling him how. 3 hours in, Jon's convulsions worsened into something Geralt recognized, with a cold lurch of dread, as the critical juncture, the point in every trial he'd ever witnessed or undergone himself where a body either found its way through the mutagenic transformation or began, instead, to fail against it entirely. Jon's back arched again, harder this time, a sound tearing from him that had no words left in it at all, and his skin had gone a shade of gray-white that Geralt had seen before, on faces that hadn't survived what came next. "Jon!" Geralt's voice sharpened, cut through the storeroom like a blade. "Jon, listen to me. You chose this. You said the words yourself. Someone has to stand at the front of what's coming, and you'd rather be able to do something than die brave and useless. That's still true. Hold on to that. Don't let this take it from you." Jon's eyes snapped open, wide, terrified but present, focused, finding Geralt's face and holding there with a desperate, clawing intensity. "Fight it," Geralt said, low and fierce. "Not the pain. Fighting the pain will kill you faster than the mutagens will. Fight for the choice. Fight because you decided this mattered. And dying now proves nothing except that the world got to decide your ending after all, the same way it's always tried to decide everything else about you. You don't owe this world an easy death, Jon. You never have." Something shifted in Jon's face, the terror still there, but something harder underneath it now. Something that Geralt recognized immediately as the exact stubborn refusal he'd watched the boy display in 100 smaller ways over the past 6 weeks, scaled up now to meet the largest challenge he'd ever faced. Jon's breathing steadied by degrees, and the gray pallor of his skin began, achingly slowly, to recede back toward something closer to normal. And his heart rate, still faster than any ordinary man's, but no longer stuttering, no longer threatening to simply stop, settled into a strong, steady rhythm that Geralt monitored with his fingers pressed against the boy's throat for nearly 20 full minutes before he allowed himself to believe it. "He's through the worst of it," he said finally, and heard his own voice come out rougher than he'd intended, thick with a relief he hadn't fully realized he'd been holding back. "Sam, get more water, clean linens, and send word to Aemon, tell him it looks like it's taking." Sam, weeping openly now with no apparent shame about it at all, nodded and scrambled for the door. Jon's eyes had drifted half-closed, exhaustion finally overtaking the fever's grip now that the crisis point had passed, but before sleep fully claimed him, his hand found Geralt's wrist and gripped it, weak but deliberate. "Did it work?" he whispered. "Ask me again in the morning," Geralt said. "Body's still finishing what it started. But you're through the part that kills most who try it. That's not a small thing, Jon. That's most of the battle already won." Jon's mouth curved, faint and exhausted, into something that was almost, despite everything, a smile. "Told you," he murmured, voice slurring toward sleep. "Told you I'd rather choose it." "You did." Geralt sat back, finally letting his own exhaustion show now that the worst danger had passed, watching the boy's chest rise and fall in a rhythm that was already subtly, no longer entirely human. "You chose it. Now sleep. The rest of this your body can finish without either of us watching every second of it." Jon slept. Outside, past the thick stone walls of the storeroom, the sky over Castle Black remained clear and still, that faint sick green bruise along the horizon holding steady, neither widening nor closing, as if the whole world beyond the wall were simply waiting, patient and cold, to see exactly what would rise from the stone beneath the old tower once morning finally came. Chapter 4. What rises? Jon slept for 2 full days. Not the fevered thrashing of the trial itself, which had finally broken somewhere in the small hours of that first night, but something deeper, stiller, a sleep so profound that on the morning of the second day Sam had come running to fetch Geralt in a genuine panic, certain the boy had slipped from healing rest into something closer to a coma. "His breathing's changed," Sam had said, breathless from the stairs. "It's too slow, Geralt. I timed it against my own and it's wrong, it's not natural." Geralt had gone and checked anyway, because a friend's worry deserved more than dismissal even when the underlying facts were sound, and found exactly what he'd expected to find. A pulse slow and deep and powerful, a body temperature that had dropped a full degree below what any Westerosi healer would call healthy, breathing drawn out long, and even because a witcher's body, even a half-made one still finishing its transformation, didn't need to work as hard to keep itself alive as an ordinary man's did. "He's fine," Geralt had told Sam. "Better than fine. This is what healing looks like, once you're not human enough anymore to heal the slow way." Sam had looked at him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his round, earnest face. "Not human enough," he repeated quietly. "Is that what he is now, not human?" "He's Jon Snow," Geralt had said, flat and certain. "Just Jon Snow with a body that'll keep him alive through things that would have killed him a week ago. Don't let the word mutant do your thinking for you, Sam. It never does anyone any favors." Jon woke properly on the evening of the second day, in the same storeroom, by the same low brazier, with Geralt sitting across from him sharpening silver, with the same patient, unhurried strokes he'd used the very first day they'd met, as if nothing at all had changed in the intervening weeks. His eyes opened, and Geralt watched them focus, really focus, in a way that took him a moment to properly register, because the transition from asleep to fully awake happened faster and cleaner than it had any right to. No groggy half-second of confusion, just a snap from unconsciousness to complete, sharp alertness. "How long?" Jon said. His voice came out steadier than Geralt expected, low and a little rough from disuse, but otherwise entirely his own. 2 days. Jon sat up, too fast, clearly startling himself with the sheer ease of the movement, muscles that should have been weak from 2 days of stillness responding instead with a fluid, effortless strength that had him halfway to standing before he'd consciously decided to move at all. He stopped himself, staring down at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. He flexed his fingers, slow, testing. "That's strange. Gets less strange the more you use it. Body needs to relearn its own limits, mostly." Geralt set silver aside and studied him properly now. The color in his face had come back wrong, or rather come back different, a shade paler than before, but with none of the sickly quality that pallor usually carried, more like the pale of skin that simply didn't need as much blood near its surface to function. His eyes, when the low brazier light caught them right, held the faintest ring of something gold near the pupil that hadn't been there before, subtle enough that a normal man might never notice it, obvious enough that Geralt, who'd looked into 1,000 Witcher eyes over the decades, saw it immediately. "How do you feel?" Jon considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things, turning it over before answering. "Loud," he said finally. "Everything's loud. Not the sound. I can hear Sam's quill scratching 2 floors up, I think, unless I'm imagining it, but that's not, I mean everything. The stone under my feet, the cold coming through that door. It's all just more. Like I've had a blanket over my senses my whole life and someone's just pulled it off. That'll settle mostly. First few weeks it's overwhelming. You'll learn to filter what matters from what doesn't. The same way you learn to read a swordsman's shoulders instead of watching every twitch of every muscle at once. Takes practice. Won't take you as long as it took me, most likely. I had to work that out from nothing. You've got me to tell you what to expect." Jon flexed his hand once more, then looked up, and there was something in his expression that Geralt recognized immediately, because he'd felt something like it himself once, a very long time ago, standing in a mountain fortress with a body that no longer quite matched the boy he remembered being. "Do I look different?" Jon asked, quietly. "To you? Do I look like someone else now?" Geralt considered lying, considered softening it, and discarded both options because Jon had earned better than either. "A little. Your eyes have caught a bit of gold near the pupil, subtle, most people won't notice unless they're looking hard or the light catches it right. You'll move different eventually, not now. You're still getting used to the new speed, but in a few months you'll walk into a room and everyone in it will feel it before they consciously register why. That's not something you'll be able to hide even if you wanted to." He held Jon's gaze steadily. "You're still you, though. Same stubborn jaw. Same habit of thinking 3 moves ahead in an argument you haven't even started yet. The mutation didn't touch any of that. It just gave the man who already existed a body that can finally keep up with everything he's always tried to do." Something in Jon's shoulders eased, fractionally at that, not full relief, not yet, but the first loosening of a fear he clearly hadn't wanted to name aloud until Geralt had named it for him. "I want to see," he said, "properly. I want to know what I can do now. Tomorrow." Geralt stood, offering a hand to help him up, more out of habit than necessity. Jon was already rising smoothly on his own, testing his balance with small, careful steps that grew steadily more confident with each one. "Tonight you eat something substantial, more than you think you need, because that body's going to want fuel it never needed before. And you rest, properly this time, ordinary sleep, so I can see how your new baseline settles before we start testing limits nobody in this world has ever tested before." Jon nodded and then, unexpectedly reached out and gripped Geralt's forearm, the same gesture men in the watch used with each other, brother to brother, an acknowledgement that went beyond simple thanks. "You didn't have to stay through all of it," he said. "The whole 2 days. Sam told me you barely left the room. Wasn't going to leave a man alone with something I asked him to risk." Geralt returned the grip briefly, then let go. "That's not how this works. Not with me." The testing, when it happened the next morning in the empty training yard before dawn, revealed exactly what Geralt had expected and Jon had not remotely prepared himself for. He put an arrow through a target from 60 yards with a bow he'd never particularly excelled at before, the shot flying true almost before he'd consciously aimed it. Some new and unerring sense of trajectory and timing, simply supplying the answer his hands needed. He caught a thrown dagger out of the air by the hilt, a reflex test Geralt had sprung on him without warning specifically, because warning would have ruined the honesty of the result. And the look on Jon's face afterward, somewhere between delight and genuine alarm at his own capability, told Geralt everything he needed to know about how thoroughly the boy's understanding of his own body had just been upended. But the sparring told the real story. Geralt came at him with steel, the way he had every day for 6 weeks, expecting to need to scale back his usual intensity to account for whatever new speed Jon had gained. He did not need to scale back. Jon met his first strike with a parry that arrived a full half-second earlier than it should have, deflecting the blade with an economy of motion that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with a body that had simply stopped needing to think its way through the decision. Geralt pressed, faster, harder, testing in earnest now, and Jon matched him, not perfectly, not with 30 years of refined technique behind the raw new speed, but matched him close enough that for the first time in longer than Geralt cared to admit, he found himself genuinely working for an exchange rather than simply performing one. He ended it with a disarm, because ending it any other way risked injuring a boy still 2 days out from a transformation that had nearly killed him. But as he stepped back, breathing slightly harder than he'd expected to, he watched Jon staring down at his own empty hand with an expression of stunned, dawning comprehension. "You were barely trying before," Jon said. It wasn't quite an accusation, more a realization landing all at once. "I was trying exactly as hard as I needed to against the swordsman you were a week ago." Geralt sheathed his blade. "That swordsman doesn't exist anymore. The one standing in front of me right now, I had to actually work to touch. That's not nothing, Jon. That's most fully trained knights south of your wall, gone in a single trial." Jon looked down at his hands again, turning them over slowly, and something moved across his face that Geralt recognized as the particular vertigo of a person realizing, all at once and irreversibly, that the shape of their own life had just changed permanently. "I don't know how to feel about this," Jon admitted quietly. "You don't have to know yet. Give it time." Geralt clapped a hand once against his shoulder. "For now, just know this, whatever's coming for this wall, you're not walking into it unarmed anymore. That's worth something, even before you've fully worked out what else it costs." Sir Alistair Thorne learned of Jon's full recovery within the hour, because half the yard had watched at least part of the sparring session through the fence rails despite the early hour, and word of a green boy nearly matching the mysterious stranger's swordwork spread through Castle Black faster than any raven could have carried it. He came to Mormont's Solar that same afternoon, and Geralt, summoned separately, arriving to find the conversation already well underway, caught the tail end of an argument that had clearly been building for some time. "An abomination in my own castle, and you'd have me simply accept it because the Lord Commander's granted permission," Thorne was saying, his voice tight with a controlled fury that Geralt had come to recognize as the man's default register whenever the subject of Geralt or Jon arose. The men are already talking. Half of them think Snow's been touched by some manner of dark magic. The other half are asking why they weren't offered the same chance, and I've had to remind no fewer than 4 recruits this morning that we are the Night's Watch, not a company of hedge wizards trading their souls for strength. The men will talk regardless of what we do, Mormont said, weary in the particular way of a commander who'd fought this exact fight, in one form or another, for the better part of a lifetime. They talked when Jon arrived a bastard with a direwolf pup nobody else wanted to raise. They'll talk about this too. Talk isn't the problem, Allizer. The problem is you'd have me pretend this wall isn't facing something none of our forefathers ever had to face, simply because the solution makes you uncomfortable. It's not discomfort, Gior. Thorne's use of the Lord Commander's given name, rather than his title, told Geralt exactly how far past formal deference the man had already traveled. It's precedent. If I let this stand unchallenged, what stops the next stranger who wanders through some tier in the sky from offering the same bargain to a dozen more of my recruits? What stops this castle from becoming something other than the Night's Watch entirely? A garrison of monsters wearing black, answerable to foreign magic instead of the oaths every one of us swore. I answer to the same oath I swore before any of this happened, Jon said, from the doorway, and Geralt turned to find him standing there, having clearly followed close enough behind to hear the tail end of the argument himself. His voice was quiet, but there was a new steadiness in it, an ease of bearing that hadn't been there a week ago. I haven't forgotten a single word of it, Sir Allizer. I don't intend to. Thorne's eyes raked over him, assessing, the way a man might assess a stranger rather than a boy he'd trained alongside for months, and something in his expression tightened at whatever he found there, some subtle shift in Jon's presence that Geralt recognized well from 30 years of watching ordinary men react to witchers for the first time. You don't even hold yourself the same way anymore, Thorne said, low. A week ago you stood in a room like you were half apologizing for taking up the space. Now you stand there like you own it. Maybe I've simply stopped apologizing for existing, Jon said. That's not the same thing as being dangerous, Sir Allizer, though I understand why the two might look similar from where you're standing. The silence that followed had a weight to it, and Geralt watched Mormont's mouth twitch, very slightly, with something that might have been approval he was too politic to voice openly in front of Thorne's obvious anger. I'll be watching, Thorne said finally to the room in general, though his eyes stayed fixed on Jon. Every one of you. And the first time whatever's been done to that boy puts a single brother of this watch in danger, the first time I will have this addressed properly. Lord Commander's fondness or number, that's not a threat. That's a promise, same as any oath. He left without waiting for a response, and the door's closing echo lingered in the Solar's quiet for several long seconds afterward. He's not wrong to worry, Mormont said, eventually, breaking the silence. Not about the danger precisely, but about the precedent. Men fear what they don't understand, and Allizer spent 30 years building his understanding of this watch on discipline and hierarchy he can measure. You've handed him something he can't measure, Master Geralt, in a castle where measurable things are often the only thing standing between order and chaos. I understand that, Geralt said. Doesn't mean I regret the choice. No, Mormont agreed, I don't imagine it does. Nor, for what it's worth, do I. He looked at Jon for a long moment, something almost paternal in his weathered face. But watch yourself, boy. A man who feels his authority slipping tends to grasp at whatever's left to hold, and Allizer Thorne has held onto very little else in this life besides his authority in this castle. Don't give him easy cause. I don't intend to give him any cause at all, Lord Commander, Jon said, beyond simply continuing to do my duty. See that you don't, Mormont said, though something in his tone suggested he understood, better than he was saying aloud, exactly how unlikely that particular hope was to survive whatever was coming. It came 11 days later, faster and worse than any of them had prepared for. The first sign was a raven arriving at dusk from a ranging party 3 days out. A short, garbled message reporting an abandoned wildling village, dozens of huts, no bodies, no blood, simply empty, as if every soul in the settlement had walked out into the snow of their own accord and never returned. Mormont had frowned over the message for a long time before ordering a larger party assembled to investigate. 20 men this time instead of the usual half-dozen, Geralt and Jon among them by unanimous, unspoken agreement. They found the village on the second day of riding, and it was exactly as the raven had described: empty, silent, cook fires long cold, meager possessions still arranged inside huts as if their owners had simply stepped out for a moment and never come back. No blood. No sign of struggle, just absence, total and complete, hanging over the place like a held breath. Geralt's medallion had begun humming the moment they crossed within a mile of the village, steady and low, and by the time they walked their horses between the abandoned huts it had built into something closer to a vibration he could feel through his sternum. "This is wrong," he said quietly to Jon riding beside him. "Not fresh-crossed monster wrong like the vampire thing in the cellar. Different. Older. This feels like something that's been building for a long time, finally breaking the surface." "Can you feel it too?" Jon asked. And there was something careful in the question. The two of them had discovered, in the weeks since the trial, that Jon's own senses had sharpened toward the supernatural in ways that echoed Geralt's medallion, a faint prickling awareness at the base of his skull whenever something unnatural drew close, though nowhere near as precise yet as the trained instrument hanging around Geralt's neck. "Feel what, exactly?" Jon's brow furrowed, listening to something beneath the wind that Geralt, for all his mutation's gifts, genuinely couldn't perceive. "Like the whole forest is holding still," he said, finally. "Waiting. Like something's about to happen and every tree, every rock, already knows it." Around them, the other rangers had grown quiet too, their horses shifting and stamping with the particular nervous energy animals displayed when they sensed something their riders hadn't yet consciously registered. One of the older men, a grizzled veteran named Chet, muttered something about turning back that nobody quite had the nerve to argue against out loud, though nobody moved to actually retreat either. The dead came at full dark, and they came in numbers Castle Black had never faced beyond the wall in living memory. The first sign was the cold, a drop so sudden and severe that breath fogged instantly, and torches guttered as if some vast unseen hand had reached down to smother the warmth out of the world. And then the whites simply rose, dozens of them, from beneath the snow itself where they'd apparently been buried, waiting in a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence. The missing villagers, Geralt realized with a cold lurch, turned and buried beneath their own homes, a trap set with patient, calculating malice that belonged to something far more intelligent than any dead thing should possess. "Fire!" Mormont bellowed, already drawing his sword, and the yard around them erupted into chaos as rangers scrambled for torches, for oil, for anything that would burn against the horde of blue-eyed corpses rising from the frozen ground in every direction at once. Geralt had silver out before he'd consciously decided to draw it, the runes along the blade catching torchlight and something else besides, a faint responsive shimmer that told him the metal itself recognized what it was about to face. "Jon, watch the flanks, they'll try to circle the horses." But Jon was already moving, and what Geralt witnessed in the next several minutes settled, permanently, any lingering doubt he might have carried about whether the trial had truly taken. Jon moved through the whites with a fluid, brutal efficiency that had nothing in common with the earnest, effortful swordsman Geralt had first sparred against months ago. He read the chaos of the fight the way Geralt himself would have read it, not panicking at the sheer numbers, but sorting them, prioritizing, striking at the whites closing on unprotected rangers before turning to meet threats aimed at himself. His blade finding joints and tendons, with a precision that dropped corpses that steel alone should never have been able to fell. A white came at Chet's back. The old ranger too occupied fending off two others to notice the third closing from behind, and Jon crossed the distance in a burst of speed that Geralt, even having witnessed the training yard sparring, still found himself blinking at. There and gone, a blur of black wool and steel. The white's head separated from its shoulders before it had closed the final 3 feet toward Chet's exposed spine. "Behind you!" Jon shouted, already turning, already moving toward the next threat before Chet had even finished his startled, grateful glance backward. Geralt fought his way through his own share of the horde, Silver's runes flaring hot and bright with every strike that connected, the whites collapsing into inert stillness the moment the enchanted metal touched their unnatural flesh. A small mercy, at least, that whatever crossbred wrongness might be feeding these others, ordinary silver still worked exactly the way it always had. But it was Jon, at the center of the fight, who turned the tide. Geralt watched him take command without anyone appointing him to it, calling out flanking threats before the men beside him had registered the danger, dragging a wounded ranger clear of a swarm with strength that shouldn't have belonged to any 19-year-old boy, meeting 3 whites at once in a tight defensive stance, and dropping all 3 within the space of a dozen heartbeats, while Gren and Pip, fighting back to back beside him, simply stared in open astonishment between their own desperate strikes. The battle lasted the better part of an hour before the last white finally collapsed and stayed collapsed, and when the smoke and torchlight finally settled over a field littered with unmoving, unnatural corpses, the count came back grim but survivable. 3 rangers dead, 5 wounded, against a threat that, by every account any of the surviving veterans could offer afterward, should have overwhelmed and killed every man present. Mormont found Jon standing at the field's edge afterward, breathing hard but steady, blood, not his own, streaked across his face and hands, and looked at him for a long, silent moment before speaking. "You held that flank alone," Mormont said quietly. "Chet tells me you saved his life twice over. Gren says the same, and Pip besides." "I did what needed doing," Jon said. "Same as everyone else out here tonight." Mormont's voice had gone rough, uncharacteristically emotional for a man who'd spent decades cultivating a careful, weathered composure. "Not the same as everyone else. I've commanded this watch for longer than you've been alive, boy, and I have never, not once, seen a man move through a fight the way you moved tonight. Whatever that stranger's ritual gave you, it may well have saved every life still standing in this field." He clasped Jon's shoulder, hard, the gesture of a commander who'd run out of formal words for what he actually meant. "The watch owes you a debt tonight it can't properly repay. I intend to see that acknowledged, whatever Alizer Thorne has to say about the manner of it." Jon's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of Thorne's name, but he said nothing, and Geralt, coming up beside them with silver still bare in his hand, caught the flicker of unease crossing the boy's face and understood immediately what it meant. That tonight's victory, however necessary and however hard one, had just handed Thorne a fresh grievance to work with, proof in the eyes of frightened, superstitious men that the stranger's alchemy had made Jon Snow into something no longer quite of their world. And that fear, in Geralt's long experience, rarely stayed grateful for very long once the immediate danger had passed. The ride back to Castle Black was somber despite the victory, 3 dead men wrapped and slung across saddles, and Jon rode near the rear of the column apart from the others, his expression distant in a way Geralt recognized as something more than simple exhaustion. "You saved a dozen lives tonight," Geralt said, drawing his horse alongside. "Chet's, Gren's, half that column's most likely if that flank had broken. I know. Jon's voice was quiet. I felt it happening out there. The speed, the strength, exactly like you said it would come. And it did come when I needed it, and I used it, and men who'd have died didn't die. He was silent for a moment, watching the dark tree line pass on either side of the trail. But I also felt something else. When I killed that first white coming up on Chet, I didn't feel anything. Not fear, not even the usual heat of a fight. Just calculation, like watching a puzzle solve itself. Is that the mutation too? Is that something it took from me? Geralt considered the question carefully, because he'd asked himself some version of it decades ago and never fully settled on an answer he entirely trusted. Some, he admitted. The trial dulls certain instincts that get in the way of survival fear response, mostly the part of you that would otherwise freeze or hesitate at the worst possible moment. That's not nothing to lose. It's also brutally exactly what let you save those lives tonight instead of freezing at the sight of 24 dead men rising from the snow at once. But it's still me making the choice to save them, isn't it? Even without the fear. It's still you, Geralt said firm. The mutation doesn't decide who you fight for, Jon. It just makes sure you're capable of doing something about it once you've decided. Tonight you decided to save Chet, to hold that flank, to drag a wounded man clear instead of just saving yourself. That's not the mutagen's choice. That was entirely yours. Jon nodded slowly, something in his shoulders easing slightly at the answer, though Geralt noticed he still glanced back once at the wrapped shapes of the 3 dead men slung across their saddles, and understood that whatever peace the boy found in that answer, the grief for those he hadn't been fast enough to save would stay with him regardless, which, Geralt thought grimly, was probably exactly as it should be. A witcher who stopped grieving the ones he couldn't save had usually, by that point, stopped being much worth saving anyone at all. They reached Castle Black past midnight, the gates already opening at the sight of the returning column's torches, and Sam was waiting in the yard, having clearly not slept at all in their absence, his relief at seeing them both upright and largely unharmed visible even in the darkness. But it was the sight beyond Sam that caught Geralt's attention and held it. Thorn, standing near the armory door with 3 other officers Geralt recognized as men closely aligned with his particular faction within the Watch's fractious politics. Their expressions grim and calculating in a way that had nothing to do with relief at the column's safe return, and everything to do, Geralt suspected with a cold certainty settling in his gut, with whatever plan Thorn had already begun assembling in the days since the argument in Mormont's Solar. Tonight's battle had proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, exactly what Jon Snow had become capable of. It remained to be seen whether Castle Black would celebrate that fact, or fear it enough to try to end it. Chapter 5. The White Wolf and the Black Bastard. The tribunal, when it came, wasn't called a tribunal at all. Thorn was too careful a politician for that, whatever else Geralt thought of him, and he'd learned, apparently, that a direct assault on Mormont's authority would fail where a slower, quieter erosion might succeed. So instead of a formal hearing, there was simply a council, officers of the Watch summoned to the Lord Commander's Solar on the pretext of discussing the White incursion and how best to prepare the wall against a repeat of it. And it was in the middle of that council, 3 days after the battle at the abandoned village, that Thorn finally showed his hand. "We should discuss," he said, once the immediate tactical matters had been laid out and Mormont had begun steering the conversation toward closing remarks, "what happened to Snow, and whether it's a precedent this Watch can afford to keep." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms went quiet when everyone present had been waiting for exactly this moment and hoping it wouldn't arrive. "Say what you mean plainly, Alizer," Mormont said, tired. "We've circled this long enough." "Plainly, then." Thorn set both hands flat on the table and Geralt watched him choose his words with the deliberate care of a man who'd rehearsed this speech more than once in private. 3 men died in that field 11 nights past. Good men, men I trained myself. Men who deserved better than to be buried beneath frozen ground at the edge of the world. And I've had 5 separate rangers come to me since, unprompted, telling me they watched Jon Snow move through 24 whites like they were nothing. Not like a skilled swordsman, not like a lucky one, but like something that had simply stopped being a man at all. Faster than a horse can run. Strong enough to lift a wounded man one-armed while fighting off 3 corpses with the other. I don't say this to diminish what he did. I say it because I have spent 30 years teaching men that discipline and steel are what keep them alive at this wall. And now half my recruits believe the true answer is foreign magic and a stranger's poison, and I do not know how I am meant to command men who no longer believe in the thing I've spent my life teaching them to believe in. You'd rather 3 more men had died, Mormont said flat, to preserve a belief. I'd rather this watch remain something men understand. Thorne's voice hardened. You cannot build an army of Jon Snows, Gior. The stranger said himself. Half who undergo this ritual die from it. We have perhaps 40 rangers capable of real fighting at this castle, and you'd have me risk them on the chance that some might survive to become what he's become. What happens to this watch when word reaches the other castles along the wall? Eastwatch, the Shadow Tower, that Castle Black's solution to the whites is alchemy from beyond the world, administered by a man none of us can properly vouch for. What happens when it reaches King's Landing? Do you imagine the Iron Throne looks kindly on rumors of sorcery practiced at the wall, however desperate the cause? It was, Geralt had to admit, listening from where he stood near the door with his arms crossed, a more dangerous argument than the ones Thorne had raised before, not fear dressed as principle this time, but genuine political calculation. The kind that could actually move men who otherwise had no personal stake in whether Jon lived or died. I'm not proposing an army, Geralt said before Mormont could answer. I never proposed one. I offered one man a choice, because that man was the one person in this castle I trusted to make it with his eyes open. I've no intention of turning your watch into a school of witchers, Sir Alizer, whatever rumors decided to make of it. And if I told you, Thorne said, turning to face him directly, that the Lord Commander's Council would prefer you cease training anyone at all in this castle, and prepare instead to leave the moment your way home reopens, with no further alchemy performed on any man wearing black, you'd be telling me something I already intend to do regardless of your council's preference. Geralt held his gaze, unhurried. I've no interest in remaking your watch, Sir Alizer. I've every interest in keeping the one man I did change alive long enough to matter, and in keeping this castle standing against whatever's coming, because I've seen what's coming and I don't much like the shape of it. Those 2 interests happen to align right now. If your council wants to pretend otherwise, that's your business, but don't mistake caution for cowardice. And don't mistake my patience for permission to threaten a man who saved your rangers' lives 11 nights ago. Something dangerous flickered behind Thorne's eyes at that, but before he could answer, Mormont's voice cut across the room, weary but absolute. Enough. He rose, slow with age but with an authority that filled the small solar entirely. I have heard every argument this council has to offer, and I will say this once plainly, so there's no confusion afterward about where I stand. Jon Snow saved this watch's rangers 11 nights past through means none of us fully understand, and I will not punish a man for surviving a choice he made with full knowledge of its risk, simply because that survival makes lesser men uncomfortable. If word of it reaches the other castles, then let it reach them. If it reaches King's Landing, then let the Iron Throne concern itself with a threat it spent generations pretending doesn't exist, while men die defending a wall the realm's forgotten to properly thank. I did not ask to be Lord Commander to preside over comfortable men making comfortable decisions, while good rangers freeze to death in the snow. I asked, if I ever truly asked at all, to keep this watch standing against whatever waits beyond that ice, by whatever means proves necessary to do it. He looked around the room, meeting each officer's eyes in turn, and Geralt watched several of them, men who'd perhaps come into this meeting sympathetic to Thorne's argument, shift uncomfortably under that gaze, old loyalty and older respect reasserting itself despite whatever doubts the last weeks had planted. "This council is finished," Mormont said. "Alliser, a word alone before you go." The room emptied slowly, Thorne's allies filing out with expressions that told Geralt the argument was far from settled in their private thoughts, whatever Mormont's authority had accomplished in the room itself. Geralt lingered at the door long enough to catch the tail end of the private conversation that followed, Mormont's voice, lower now, tired in a way that had nothing to do with anger. "You've served me 30 years, Alliser. I won't insult that service by pretending I don't understand your fear. But I need you loyal to this castle's survival before you're loyal to the shape you'd prefer that survival to take. Can you give me that much?" Thorne's answer, when it came, was quiet enough that Geralt only caught the last of it. "I've given this watch everything I have to give, Gior. I'll give it my loyalty too, if that's what you're asking. But I'll be watching that stranger and the thing he's made just the same. That's not a promise I'll break for anyone." Geralt walked away before either man noticed him listening, turning the conversation over in his mind with the particular unease of a man who recognized, in Thorne's grudging compliance, not resolution, but simply a fuse burning slower than he'd like. The relative quiet lasted 11 days, long enough for Jon's new reflexes to settle into something he no longer had to consciously manage every waking moment, long enough for the whispers around the castle to shift, gradually, from fear toward something closer to wary awe. The recruits who'd once avoided his eye now watching him in the training yard with open curiosity. A few even asking, quietly and without Thorne's knowledge, whether the offer Geralt had made might ever be extended again. It was during those 11 days that Jon met Ygritte. She wasn't captured in any dramatic ambush, nothing so clean as that. A ranging party, 12 men including Jon and 2 of the older veterans, had gone out to scout the aftermath of the village massacre more thoroughly, searching for any sign of where the Whites' apparent commander had come from or gone, and they'd found instead a lone wildling scout, half frozen and separated from whatever larger raiding party she'd been traveling with, hiding in a thicket with an arrow already nocked and aimed square at the first ranger through the trees. She hadn't loosed it in the end, because Jon had spotted the tension in the branches half a second before anyone else registered the danger, new senses doing exactly what Geralt had promised they would, and called a halt loud enough that the wildling, seeing herself outnumbered 12-1 with no possibility of escape, had lowered the bow herself rather than die for nothing. "Kissed by fire," she said, when they brought her in bound but unharmed, nodding at Jon's face in the torchlight of the yard with a directness that startled him visibly. Her hair was a deep, fierce red, wild and unbraided, and her eyes held none of the fear Geralt would have expected from a prisoner facing an armed garrison at the edge of the world, only a sharp, assessing curiosity that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the way Jon himself had looked at that first frostbitten stranger bleeding in the snow months ago. "What's that mean?" Jon asked. "Means the old gods marked you for something." She tilted her head, studying him with open frankness despite the ropes at her wrists. "Not your hair, Crow. Your eyes. Something's touched you that shouldn't have. You've got a bit of gold caught in there like a wolf that swallowed the moon." She grinned, sudden and sharp. "Never seen a crow with eyes like that before. You're new." "Ygritte," she offered when nobody else volunteered introductions, apparently unbothered by the fact that she was a prisoner offering her name freely to her captors. And you lot are about 3 days too late to catch anything worth catching. Whatever killed that village, it's long gone north again by now. You won't find it by tramping around in the snow looking important. You know what did it, Jon said, sharper now, all business. I know what it wasn't. Wasn't raiders, wasn't a bear, wasn't anything with a heartbeat. Her grin faded, something colder settling behind her eyes. The free folk have been running south for a reason, Crow, and it's not because we suddenly took a liking to your precious wall. Something's woken up past the frost fangs that none of us have got a name old enough for. Mance. She stopped herself visibly, the name slipping out before she decided to share it, and covered the slip with practiced ease. Mance says we run or we die. I'd rather not die. So here I am, running, and now I'm tied up in your yard instead, which frankly isn't much of an improvement. They kept her at Castle Black rather than executing her outright, Mormont's decision, over Thorne's predictable objection, on the grounds that a wildling this close to the wall with knowledge of whatever was driving the free folk south represented intelligence too valuable to waste on a quick, satisfying hanging. Jon found himself assigned, more often than either of them entirely admitted to enjoying, to the duty of questioning her, which mostly meant sitting across from her in a storage room turned makeshift cell, trading information in careful increments, each testing how much the other actually knew against how much either was willing to reveal. You're not like the other crows, Ygritte told him on the fourth such conversation, watching him with that same frank, appraising curiosity she'd shown from the start. Don't move like them. Don't smell like them either, if I'm honest, though maybe that's rude to say to a man's face. What do I smell like then? Cold. She said it simply, without malice, the way she might have described weather. Not the ordinary kind. The kind that gets into a man from somewhere else and doesn't quite belong to him proper. My grandmother would have called you touched. Not cursed, mind. Touched. There's a difference, though I'd wager your Maester wouldn't know it. Jon didn't answer that directly, uncertain how much of the trial he was permitted or wise to reveal to a wildling prisoner, however oddly disarming her honesty proved to be. But he found himself, in the weeks that followed, seeking out her company more than duty strictly required, drawn by something he couldn't fully name, not romance yet, not quite, though the shape of it hovered at the edges of every conversation, but something closer to recognition. She, too, had never quite fit the world that raised her. She, too, carried the particular loneliness of someone the powerful had decided, long before she'd had any say in it, to define by where she'd come from rather than who she actually was. Geralt noticed, of course, because Geralt noticed most things and said nothing of it directly beyond a single dry observation, delivered while they cleaned weapons together one evening in the armory. She's dangerous, he said. Not to you particularly. To the careful distance you've been keeping between yourself and everyone in this castle since the trial. That kind of honesty tends to close distances people would rather keep open. You disapprove. Didn't say that. Geralt ran the whetstone along Silver's edge unhurried. Said it's dangerous. Different thing entirely. Most things worth having are dangerous, one way or another. I'd know. Jon said nothing to that, but something in his face suggested the observation had landed somewhere true. The larger danger revealed itself 20 days after the village massacre, when a second raven arrived, this one not garbled but coherent, terrifyingly so, from a border outpost 2 days' ride north that reported a force of the dead moving south in numbers no scout had ever recorded, organized in a way that no mindless horde of whites should have been capable of organizing. Led, the message insisted. Though the ranger who'd sent it had clearly struggled with how to phrase something his mind rebelled against believing, by something on horseback, something that had once been a man and no longer was, riding at the head of the column like a general reviewing troops, its presence alone enough to send half the outpost's garrison fleeing south in a panic that had cost 3 men their lives to the very cold they were fleeing through. Geralt's medallion, upon hearing the description relayed second-hand by a badly shaken messenger, had begun to hum with an intensity he hadn't felt since the tear first spat him out into the snow 6 months ago. "That's not an ordinary white," he told Mormont and Jon that same night in the Lord Commander's solar, spreading a rough map across the table. "Whites don't organize. They don't ride horses. Cold-touched corpses don't have the coordination for it, let alone the intent. Whatever's leading that column, it's kept enough of what it was or gained enough of something new to think and plan. That's your other's hand directly in this, not just dead men rising on instinct." "Can it be killed?" Mormont asked. "Everything can be killed. Questions whether we can find the right way to do it before it reaches your wall." Geralt studied the map, tracing the likely path a large, organized force would take through the terrain north of Castle Black. "I want to see it myself before I commit to any plan. Numbers in a panicked ranger's report are never reliable, and neither is a description filtered through terror. I need to know what we're actually facing." "You mean to ride out and look at it," Mormont said. "Alone." "Not alone." Geralt glanced at Jon, who'd already straightened, already understanding without needing to be asked. "I'm coming," Jon said. "It wasn't a question." "I know," Geralt said. "Wasn't asking permission. Just confirming you'd already decided before I finished the sentence." Mormont studied them both for a long moment, weighing something behind his tired eyes. "Take Sam's research with you," he said, finally. "Whatever he's found about old crossings, old wards. If this thing riding south is drawing strength from whatever's leaking through your tear, you'll want every piece of knowledge you can carry. And Jon," his voice softened just slightly, the tone of a commander who'd come, over these past months, to feel something closer to fatherly concern than simple professional respect. "Come back. This watch has already asked more of you than any recruit should reasonably be asked to give. Don't let pride convince you that you owe it more than that." "I don't intend to die out there, Lord Commander," Jon said. "I've got too much left unfinished to allow it." They rode out 2 days later, just the two of them, deliberately small and quiet rather than another full-ranging party. Geralt's judgment, based on 30 years of scouting dangerous things without becoming the thing that got noticed first. The cold deepened steadily the further north they traveled, the ordinary bite of Westerosi winter giving way, gradually, to something Geralt recognized with grim familiarity, a cold that carried a texture to it, an intention. The same wrongness his medallion had first flagged in the haunted forest months ago now grown vastly, unmistakably stronger. "You feel that," Jon said. On the third night, both of them crouched around a carefully shielded fire that barely held back the deepening chill. "Feel it." Geralt's hand rested near Silver's hilt, an old, unconscious habit. "This is what a wide-open tear feels like up close. Whatever's on the other side of it, it's not just leaking through anymore. It's pouring." They found the column on the 5th day, from a ridge overlooking a wide frozen valley, and even Geralt, who'd catalogued horrors across 3 decades and a dozen different kinds of undead, felt something cold settle in his gut at the sheer scale of what moved below them. Hundreds, perhaps more than hundreds. The column stretched far enough into the tree line that an accurate count proved impossible. Ranks of whites moving with a silent, disciplined uniformity that no ordinary corpse horde should have possessed. And at the column's head, exactly as the panicked ranger had described, a rider. It sat a horse that was itself dead and moving, frost sheathing its skeletal frame in patterns too intricate and deliberate to be simple decay. And the rider atop it wore the tattered remnants of what might once have been Night's Watch black, its face beneath a frost-crusted hood a mask of pale, waxen flesh stretched too tight over bone. Its eyes, when it turned slowly, as if sensing their observation from a mile distant, burning with a blue so intense it seemed to cast its own faint, sickly light across the snow. Geralt's medallion had gone from humming to a full, painful vibration, and something in that gaze, even at this distance, carried a weight that pressed against his mind like a physical hand. "That's not just a white commander," he said low. "That's something wearing a white's body the way a puppeteer wears a puppet, something with real intelligence behind those eyes. Can you feel it looking at us?" Jon's voice had gone tight. "I can feel it looking for us. Not the same thing, not yet." Geralt eased back from the ridge's edge, pulling Jon with him by the shoulder before the creature's attention could sharpen into something more precise. "We need to get back. Mormont needs to know the true scale of this, and Sam needs to know exactly what we're dealing with, because whatever knowledge his research has dug up, I suspect we're about to need every piece of it." They retreated through the trees at speed, both of them moving with a silent economy that spoke to how thoroughly Jon's new instincts had settled, and it was perhaps 2 miles into that retreat, cutting across a frozen stream bed, that the ambush came. 3 whites, smaller scouts peeled off from the main column, dropped from the low branches of trees they'd apparently been using to shadow the pair unnoticed. Unnoticed by Jon, at least. Geralt's medallion had flared a half-second warning that gave him just enough time to shout before steel and cold flesh collided. Jon moved to meet the nearest without hesitation, longsword finding the joint at its knee with brutal precision, dropping it into the snow before pivoting to catch a second white's clawed swing on his blade's flat, the impact ringing loud through the frozen air. Geralt took the third with a single clean thrust of silver through what remained of an eye socket, the white collapsing instantly into stillness the moment the enchanted metal touched it. But the second white Jon fought proved tougher than the ordinary corpses they'd faced at the village, faster, its movements carrying a coordination that mirrored the disciplined ranks they'd just observed. And Geralt understood, watching the fight unfold, that whatever intelligence commanded that column had begun training even its lowliest scouts in something approaching actual tactics. Jon adapted within seconds, though, stepping back from a strike that would have opened his throat, reading the white's shift in weight the exact way Geralt had spent months teaching him to read any opponent, and countering with a strike that severed the creature's spine at the neck, dropping it permanently into the snow. Silence fell over the stream bed, broken only by both men's ragged breathing. "They're learning," Jon said, staring down at the fallen white. "Actually learning. Fighting smarter than the ones at the village. Because something's teaching them too." Geralt wiped silver clean against his thigh, glancing back toward the ridge they just fled, toward the distant column still moving south with its terrible, patient discipline. "That rider isn't just leading a horde anymore, Jon. It's building an army. And armies that learn from their mistakes are a great deal harder to kill than mindless ones." They made camp that night further south than either of them would have liked, both too aware of how close the column's outriders had already come. And it was there, huddled close to a fire kept low and shielded from any distant eyes, that Geralt felt something shift. Not around him, but inside his own chest against his sternum, where the medallion hung. It had stopped its steady, threatening vibration, and settled instead into a different rhythm entirely, pulsing, rhythmic, almost gentle by comparison, a pattern Geralt recognized with a jolt of genuine surprise because he'd felt something almost like it exactly once before, in the instant just before the Wild Hunt rider's blade had opened his side and the tear had swallowed him whole. "What is it?" Jon asked, watching his face. "The tear," Geralt said slowly, working through the implication even as he spoke it aloud. "It's stabilizing. Not closing, not yet, not from what I can feel, but it's found some kind of rhythm, some pattern. That means it's getting ready to do something. Might mean it's finally sealing itself shut for good. Might mean it's about to open wide enough to let something through that dwarfs everything we've faced so far. He pressed a hand flat against his chest, feeling the pulse of the medallion through wool and leather, and felt something colder than the deepening winter settle into his gut. Might also mean it's finally stable enough for me to go home. Jon was quiet for a long moment, staring into the low fire, and when he spoke his voice had gone careful, deliberately even, the tone of a man working hard to keep something larger and messier out of his words. When, he asked, how long do you have? Don't know yet. Days, maybe. Could be longer. Geralt met his eyes across the fire. I'll know more the closer it gets to actually opening. These things don't come with a schedule attached. And if it opens while that army's still marching south? Geralt didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer sat uncomfortably in his chest, tangled between two loyalties he hadn't expected to have to weigh against each other quite so starkly. The world he'd left behind, however chaotic and tearing apart it might currently be, and the boy across the fire from him who he'd trained, mentored, and irrevocably changed, in a world that wasn't his own, and had no particular claim on his loyalty beyond the one he'd chosen to give it freely. I don't leave unfinished business behind me, Jon, he said finally. Not when it's business I help start. Whatever that portal does, whenever it opens, I'm not walking through it until this wall's either standing or fallen, and either way, I intend to be standing beside it when the answer's decided. That's not a promise I'm making lightly. It's simply the truth of where I stand. Jon held his gaze across the low fire for a long moment, something easing in his shoulders that Geralt suspected had been coiled tight since the moment the medallion's rhythm had changed, and nodded once, slow and grateful, without needing to say the words aloud. They rode back to Castle Black 2 days later, carrying news that would reshape every plan the Watch had made, and behind them, unseen but sensed by both, the column of the dead continued its patient, disciplined march south, and somewhere in the widening tier that had brought a witcher to this frozen world in the first place, something vast and ancient stirred, testing the strength of a barrier that had held for 8,000 years and was, for the first time in all those centuries, beginning slowly, deliberately to fail. Chapter 6, No Destiny, Only Choices. Castle Black had never held a war council of this size before. Every officer, every senior ranger, Maester Aemon at the table's head with Sam hovering nervously at his shoulder, and Mormont standing rather than sitting, because a man about to ask his entire garrison to bet their lives on a stranger's word rarely found it easy to stay seated while he did it. Numbers past 400 best estimate, Geralt said, laying it out plain, no softening. Organized. Led by something that thinks plans, teaches its own scouts to fight smarter than they should. That's not a raid. That's an invasion, and it's coming for this wall specifically, because whatever's commanding it understands exactly what this wall's meant to keep out for 8,000 years. How long, Mormont said. 6 days. Maybe 7 if the terrain slows them the way it slowed us. Geralt tapped the rough map. They're not hurrying. That's the part that worries me more than the numbers. An army that doesn't need to hurry is an army that's certain it's going to win. Thorn, seated at the table's far end, hadn't spoken yet, which was itself unusual enough that several heads turned his way when he finally did. How many men can we field? 211 able to fight, counting every ranger, steward, and builder who can hold a spear, Mormont said. Against 400 of the dead led by something none of us has ever faced. Then we lose, Thorn said flatly. Simple arithmetic, Lord Commander, unless the stranger's got something in that satchel of his that changes the math. I might. Geralt looked to Sam, who startled slightly at being addressed directly in front of the entire council but rallied fast, The particular courage of a scholar finally handed proof that his research mattered. "Tell them what you found." "Dragonglass," Sam said, and had to clear his throat when his voice cracked on the word. "Obsidian, the Meisters call it dragonglass, and there's an old cache of it in the vaults beneath the shield hall. Weapons forged from it centuries back, mostly forgotten because nobody's needed them in living memory. The oldest texts I could find, wildling oral histories mostly, the ones nobody south of the wall ever bothered transcribing seriously, all agree on one thing. Fire kills the other's creatures, but dragonglass kills the others themselves." "You're certain?" Mormont said. "I'm certain the stories agree with each other independently, across sources that never could have influenced one another," Sam said. "That's the closest thing to certain I can offer you, Lord Commander, in a matter no living man's tested in 8,000 years." Geralt turned that over, cross-referencing it against everything he understood about wraiths and higher undead from his own world: volcanic glass, obsidian, materials born from fire and pressure, often held properties that disrupted certain kinds of necromantic binding. It fit. It fit well enough that he found himself, for the first time since arriving in this world, allowing himself real hope that this fight might actually be winnable rather than simply survivable. "Silver hurts what's crossed through the tear," he said. "If dragonglass hurts what's native to this world, then between the two of us, we might have something that actually threatens whatever's riding at the head of that column. I want every dragonglass weapon in that vault brought up and distributed before the week's out. Arrowheads especially. If we can put dragonglass into flight, we don't need every man to close to melee range with something that's killed rangers twice their size." "I'll see it done," Mormont said, and something in the way he said it, decisive, energized despite the grim math still stacked against them, told Geralt the old man had found in the plan forming around the table the first real foothold of hope he'd allowed himself in days. Thorn was quiet for a long moment, studying the map, studying Geralt, and then, unexpectedly, he spoke again, his voice rougher than before. "I've spent months telling this council that magic doesn't belong at this wall. I'll say now, in front of all of you, that I was arguing the wrong point entirely. The magic's already here, has been here longer than any of us, longer than the wall itself if the old stories carry any truth. The only question that ever mattered was whether we'd use what we had to fight it, or die pure and useless instead." He looked at Jon directly, for the first time in weeks without open hostility behind it. "I don't know that I trust what's been made of you, Snow. I know I'd rather have you standing on that wall in 6 days than not." It wasn't an apology. Geralt understood men like Thorn well enough to know it would never quite become one. But it was, in its own hard-edged way, more honest and more valuable than an apology would have been. And he watched Jon absorb it with a small, grateful nod that asked for nothing more than exactly what had been offered. The 6 days that followed passed in the particular controlled chaos of a castle preparing for a siege it had never been designed to survive. Dragonglass arrowheads were forged and fitted in numbers that strained the castle's limited smiths past their usual capacity. Sam personally, overseeing the distribution with an obsessive care that Geralt suspected, was as much about managing his own fear as ensuring accuracy. Rangers who'd spent their careers fighting men and wildlings now drilled instead against straw targets, meant to simulate the unnatural durability of the wights, learning to strike joints and necks with dragonglass points, instead of aiming for center mass the way ordinary combat instinct demanded. Ygritte, released from her makeshift cell on Mormont's authority, once the scale of the threat became clear to everyone including her captors, proved unexpectedly invaluable, not merely for the intelligence she offered about the free folk's own encounters with the advancing dead, but for a fierce, practical competence with a bow that put half the castle's trained rangers to shame. "Your lot's been fighting this wrong for generations," she told Jon, watching him drill a line of nervous stewards in basic dragonglass strike technique. Standing in neat little rows, waiting to be hit. Free folk don't fight that way. We hit and we run and we hit again from somewhere they don't expect. Your wall's got height on its side, use it. Rain arrows down before the dead ever reach your gate. Thin their numbers before a single man has to swing a sword close enough to get grabbed. You'd fight with us, Jon said. It wasn't quite a question, though there was genuine uncertainty in it. The wildling and the Watch had been enemies for generations, and asking her to bleed for a castle that had, until recently, held her prisoner carried weight neither of them took lightly. I'd fight against what's coming, Ygritte said, sharp and immediate. Doesn't matter whose wall it's marching toward. Those things killed my own kin same as they'll kill yours if nobody stops them here. This isn't your fight or my fight, Crow. It's everybody's, whether the old stories ever bothered saying so plainly enough for men to listen. She grinned, sudden and fierce, cutting through the gravity of the moment. Besides, somebody's got to make sure you don't get yourself killed being noble about it. I've grown rather fond of that gold catching in your eyes. Be a waste to lose it. Jon's answering smile was small, but Geralt, watching from across the yard, caught the particular ease that had settled into the boy's shoulders whenever Ygritte was near. Not the ease of a man who'd stopped carrying weight, but the ease of a man who'd finally found someone willing to help him carry it. The medallion's pulse had grown steadily more insistent through those 6 days. The rhythmic stability Geralt had felt on the ridge sharpening now into something closer to certainty. And on the evening of the 5th day, sitting alone on the same rookery tower roof where he'd first watched the sky bruise green months ago, he felt it cross a threshold he recognized immediately and completely. The tear was ready to open. Not tonight. But soon, within days, he judged, perhaps even within hours of whenever the true crisis of the coming battle finally broke. Jon found him there an hour later, having apparently guessed exactly where to look, and settled beside him without needing to ask what had put that particular stillness into Geralt's face. It's close, Jon said, not a question. Close enough that I'll likely know the exact hour before it happens. Could be tomorrow. Could be the day after the battle if it holds that long. Geralt kept his eyes on the northern horizon, where that sick green bruise had, in recent weeks, begun pulsing faintly in time with something vast and distant that neither of them could properly name. I won't lie to you about wanting to go home, Jon. There's a world on the other side of that tear that's mine in ways this one, for all I've come to care about it, never quite will be. People I left half-finished business with. A girl I raised who isn't my blood but is more mine than most things I've ever claimed. I know. Jon's voice was steady, carrying none of the resentment Geralt had half-braced himself to hear. You told me from the start you'd go home the moment you could. I never expected different. I know you didn't. Geralt turned to look at him properly. Doesn't make the choosing any simpler, now that it's actually in front of me instead of some distant hypothetical. I've spent 6 months in this world doing more good, more directly, than I managed in the last 6 years back home chasing coin between contracts nobody remembered by the following season. That's not a small thing to walk away from, Jon. Whatever else it is. Jon was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone careful in the particular way it did when he was working through something that mattered too much to say clumsily. You told me once there's no destiny, he said. Only choices. That's what you believe, isn't it? Not just something you said to convince me to take the trial. It's what I believe. Nearly the only thing I've ever believed with any real conviction. Geralt's jaw tightened slightly. Watched too many people ruin their lives chasing some prophecy or fate somebody else decided belonged to them, when the truth was simpler and harder all at once. Nobody's owed a destiny. Nobody's cursed with one either. You've just got choices, one after another, and what you make of them is the only thing that ever actually belongs to you. Then that's true for you too. Jon met his eyes directly. You're not fated to stay here fighting my battles forever, Geralt. And you're not obligated to feel guilty for choosing to go home when the door opens, either. That's just another choice. Doesn't need justifying to me or to anyone else. Geralt felt something loosen in his chest at that, a knot he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying since the medallion's rhythm first shifted, not resolved, not yet, but eased by the simple, generous clarity of a young man giving him permission he hadn't known he needed. You're a better man than the world's given you credit for, Geralt said quietly. I mean that plainly, Jon, not as comfort, as fact. Learned it from somewhere, Jon said, and the small, crooked smile that followed carried enough warmth that Geralt found himself, for a moment, simply grateful for the boy across from him, for the strange, twisted path that had brought a witcher to a wall at the edge of a world that wasn't his own, and for whatever time remained before the choice in front of him finally had to be made. The army arrived at dawn on the 6th day, exactly as Geralt had calculated, the horizon north of Castle Black turning first gray, then black, then a moving carpet of frost-touched dead stretching further than any single vantage point could properly measure, the Wraith Rider at its head sitting motionless atop its skeletal horse, as if surveying, with patient contempt, the small huddle of stone and ice that had dared stand in its way for 8,000 years. Mormont had arranged the defense with every scrap of tactical wisdom 4 decades of command could offer, archers massed along the wall's top, dragonglass arrows stacked in ready supply, the gate itself reinforced and manned by the heaviest fighters the garrison could field, Jon and Geralt held in reserve near the center, ready to move wherever the line needed reinforcing most. They'll test the gate first, Geralt said, watching the distant column begin its advance across the open ground before the wall. Numbers like that, they'll want to see if brute force alone breaks it before their commander commits to anything cleverer. He was right. The first wave hit the gate within the hour, a churning mass of wights throwing themselves against reinforced wood and iron, with a mindless persistence that the defenders met with a rain of dragonglass arrows from above. Dark bodies collapsing by the dozen into unmoving heaps that the following ranks simply trampled over in their advance. It's working, Sam breathed, watching from a safer vantage on the wall's inner stair, tallying results with the compulsive precision of a man who needed the numbers to make sense in order to hold his own fear at bay. The dragonglass, it's actually working, Geralt, look at the count. It's working on the wights. Geralt's eyes had fixed on the Wraith Rider, still motionless at the rear of the advancing column, clearly content to let its lesser creatures absorb the first losses while it studied the defense for weaknesses. Rider hasn't moved. That's not patience. That's a commander waiting to see exactly what we've got before it commits anything that actually matters to it. The waiting ended 2 hours into the assault, when the gate, battered relentlessly despite the mounting losses among the attacking wights, finally began to splinter along one hinge, and the Wraith Rider, sensing the breach forming, finally spurred its dead horse forward at a speed that closed the distance faster than anything of that size should have moved. That's our cue, Geralt said, and he and Jon were already moving before Mormont's shouted order to reinforce the gate had fully left his mouth. They reached the breaking gate just as the hinge finally gave, a section of reinforced wood tearing free and dropping a dozen defenders into direct contact, with the white tide flooding through the gap. And Geralt waded into that chaos with Silver already singing through the frozen air, dropping 3 wights in as many strikes while Jon fought beside him with a speed and precision that had, by now, become something the entire garrison simply expected rather than marveled at. But it was the Wraith Rider, forcing its way through the breach on its skeletal horse, that drew both their attention fully, and Geralt felt his medallion flare hot and painful against his chest the instant the creature's burning blue gaze found his own across the churning battlefield. "That's for us," he shouted to Jon, already angling toward the horse and rider even as ordinary wights clawed and grasped at his legs from every side. "Nobody else can hurt that thing. We take it, or it walks through this gate and slaughters every man behind us." Jon didn't answer with words, only with the sudden, decisive shift of his own path, cutting through the press of lesser wights with brutal economy to close the distance toward the rider before it could fully clear the breach. The Wraith Rider met Jon's first strike with a blade of frost-forged ice that shattered on contact with dragonglass-edged steel, and the shock of that failure seemed to ripple through the creature's frame. The first sign, Geralt registered with grim satisfaction, that this thing hadn't accounted for facing weapons that could actually harm it. "It doesn't know dragonglass yet," Geralt shouted, closing from the flank. "Keep it reacting, don't give it time to adjust." The creature's second strike came faster, its dead horse rearing and lashing out with hooves that cracked frozen ground where they landed, and Jon rolled clear of the impact with a fluid economy that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago, coming up already swinging, his blade catching the rider's frost-wrapped arm and drawing a hiss of something that wasn't quite pain, but carried the same startled, wounded quality regardless. Geralt closed the last of the distance and drove silver into the horse's skeletal flank, the enchanted metal disrupting whatever unnatural binding held the dead animal upright, and the creature collapsed beneath its rider with a sound like breaking glass, throwing the Wraith Commander clear into the churned, bloody snow. It rose fast, too fast for something wearing a dead man's body, and this time its burning eyes fixed on Geralt directly, some ancient recognition sparking behind that terrible blue, as if it understood, on some level neither man could fully parse, precisely what kind of threat a Witcher's silver represented against everything it was and everything that had made it. "You," it said, and the voice that emerged was wrong in every possible register, layered and echoing as if a dozen dead throats spoke in unison through the same ruined mouth. "Do not belong to this world at all. Neither do you, apparently, if that voice is anything to judge by," Geralt said, circling, watching for an opening. "Whatever's on the other side of that tier, it's been talking to you, hasn't it? Teaching you things your own kind never needed to know before. It offers strength." The creature's blade reformed from the frozen air itself, ice crystallizing into something sharp and terrible in its grasp, strength enough to finish what 8,000 years of patience have been building toward. "You should not have followed it here, Witcher. You should have stayed on your own side of the dying and let this world's ending belong entirely to itself." It came at him fast, faster than the horse had moved, and Geralt met the strike with steel rather than silver, buying himself the half-second he needed to shift his grip. And it was in that half-second that Jon's blade came in from the creature's blind side, dragonglass biting deep into what remained of its shoulder. The Wraith Commander screamed, a sound that seemed to tear the very air around them, frost bursting outward in a wave that dropped a dozen nearby wights into sudden, frozen stillness and staggered, its form flickering at the edges like a candle flame caught in a violent wind. "Now," Geralt shouted, and drove silver forward into the wound Jon's strike had already opened, the enchanted metal and the dragonglass working in tandem against a creature that had never, in all its ancient existence, faced a threat built from 2 different worlds' worth of accumulated knowledge at once. The Wraith Commander's form came apart, not into ash, not cleanly, but into a scattering, shrieking dispersal of frost and shadow that fled outward across the battlefield, and then simply ceased, the pressure of its presence lifting from the air so suddenly that several nearby defenders staggered, as if a physical weight had been removed from their shoulders. The remaining wights, deprived of whatever coordination the commander's presence had lent them, began almost immediately to falter, their disciplined ranks dissolving back into the mindless, scattered violence Geralt recognized from every previous encounter, easier now for the defenders to pick apart with dragonglass and fire and simple, grim determination. "Is it dead?" Jon asked, breathing hard, staring at the space where the creature had unraveled into nothing. "Scattered. Weakened." Geralt scanned the churned battlefield, cataloging the fight's remaining shape with the professional detachment 30 years of combat had trained into him. Even now, even here. "Don't know if something like that can die the way ordinary things die. But it won't be commanding an army again tonight, and that's enough to matter right now." It was, indeed, enough. Within the hour, the white assault had broken entirely, the surviving dead retreating north in a scattered, mindless rout that the defenders, exhausted but victorious, watched go without any illusion that the threat had been permanently ended, only, for now, turned back. They found Thorn near the gate's inner side, propped against the shattered remains of the hinge he'd apparently spent the battle's final minutes helping to defend personally. A deep wound opened across his ribs where a wight's claws had caught him in the chaos of the breach. "Don't," he said, when Jon knelt beside him, already reaching for linens to bind the wound. "Seen enough men die at this wall to know when the binding's just for comfort rather than for saving." "You held that breach," Jon said quietly. "Half a dozen men are alive right now, because you didn't fall back when the hinge gave. Did my duty." Thorn's breathing had gone ragged, but his eyes, when they found Jon's, held something that hadn't been there in any of their previous confrontations. Not quite warmth, but something adjacent to it, hard-won and honest. "You did yours too, Snow. Whatever else I've said about what you've become, I'll not die pretending I didn't watch you save this castle tonight. Watched you and the stranger both. That's worth saying plainly before I've no more chances left to say it. You don't have to say anything." Jon's voice had gone rough. "I know I don't have to." Thorn's hand found Jon's wrist, gripping with what strength remained. "Choosing to anyway. Same as you chose that ritual, same as your stranger chose to stay and fight for a wall that isn't his. Seems this whole business has been about choosing, hasn't it, one way or another, right from the start." His grip loosened, slow, and his breathing had gone shallow, thin. "Tell the Lord Commander I died believing in this watch. All of it. Even the parts I fought against understanding." He didn't speak again. Jon held his hand until the last breath left him. And Geralt, standing a respectful distance away, felt the particular weight settle over him that always came after a fight. Not the clean satisfaction of a monster slain, but the harder, messier grief of watching a difficult, honest man die exactly as he'd lived, stubborn and dutiful to the last. The medallion's pulse sharpened into full, unmistakable clarity 3 days later, on a morning clear and cold and free, for the first time in months, of any trace of that sick green bruise along the northern horizon. "Tonight," Geralt told Mormont in the Lord Commander's solar, Jon standing silent beside him. "The tears opening tonight. I'll know the exact hour when it comes. It's close enough now that I can feel it building, same as I felt it stabilizing before the battle." "Then you'll go," Mormont said. It wasn't a question, and there was no resentment in it, only the tired acceptance of a man who'd watched enough good people come and go through this castle to understand that permanence was rarely the world's habit. "I'll go," Geralt confirmed. "There's a world on the other side that needs looking after same as this one does. And this one," he glanced at Jon, something warm and certain settling behind his usually guarded expression, "has exactly what it needs to keep standing, whether I'm here to watch it or not." Mormont extended a hand, and Geralt took it, the grip firm and lasting between two men who'd come to trust each other through months of shared, hard-won crisis. "This watch owes you a debt it can never properly repay, Master Geralt. Whatever you take with you when you go, know that you leave behind more gratitude than this cold place usually manages to offer anyone. Just look after him," Geralt said, nodding at Jon. "That's the only repayment I'd ever ask for." "I intend to," Mormont said. "Though I suspect," Before very much longer, it'll be him looking after the rest of us instead. They stood together that evening on the same stretch of frozen ground beyond the wall where Jon had first found Geralt bleeding into the snow, the medallion's pulse having built, over the preceding hours, into something Geralt recognized with absolute certainty as the final countdown before the tear finally tore open. Sam had come, and Ygritte, and even Mormont himself, wrapped heavy against the cold, none of them speaking much, simply bearing witness to whatever was about to happen. "I don't know how to thank you properly," Jon said, quietly, as the air around them began to shimmer faintly, that familiar wrongness building toward its inevitable release. "For any of it, the training, the trial, trusting me with a choice nobody else in this world would have thought to offer. Don't thank me." Geralt's voice had gone rough in a way he rarely allowed it to. "You did the hard part yourself, Jon. I just handed you the tools. Everything you've built with them, that's entirely yours." He reached into his satchel, drew out the small, careful object he'd spent the last several nights fashioning from spare metal and what remained of his alchemical supplies, and pressed it into Jon's hand. A medallion, rougher than his own, the wolf's head crudely but recognizably rendered, still faintly warm from whatever binding work he'd worked into its metal. "Yours. Finished it 3 nights back. It'll hum near what shouldn't exist, same as mine does, though it'll take you time to learn its language properly." Jon closed his fingers around it, something complicated moving across his face, grief, gratitude, and beneath both, a fierce, quiet determination that Geralt recognized as the exact shape of a man ready to carry forward what he'd been given. "There's no destiny," Geralt said, "only choices. You'll hear people call you all manner of things before this is finished, hero, monster, something in between that they haven't found proper words for yet. Don't let any of it decide who you actually are. That's the one thing this world can never take from you, whatever else it demands." The air around them tore, silent and violent all at once, a wound opening in the fabric of the evening exactly as it had torn open in a marshland 6 months and 1 entire world ago, green-black light spilling from its edges and casting strange shadows across the snow. Geralt looked at each of them in turn. Sam, wide-eyed and already, Geralt suspected, composing the account he'd spend years refining into whatever record future generations might eventually find. Ygritte watching Jon with open, unhidden affection that promised a future neither of them had fully mapped, yet but both, clearly, intended to walk toward together. Mormont, weathered and solemn, a commander who'd trusted a stranger's word and been rewarded for it. And last, Jon, standing tall and certain in a way the frightened, uncertain boy who dragged him 3 miles through the snow all those months ago could never have imagined becoming. "Take care of each other," Geralt said. "That's the only real magic that's ever mattered in any world I've walked through." He turned toward the widening tier, drew silver one last time in salute rather than combat, and stepped forward into the churning green-black light. For a moment just before the tier closed behind him, Jon thought he heard, carried on some wind that belonged to neither world entirely, a voice, rough, familiar, already fading, offering one last, simple truth into the space between 2 realities finally, permanently, sealing themselves apart once more. "Choose well." Then the light was gone, and the sky above Castle Black settled back into ordinary, star-strewn darkness, and Jon Snow stood alone at the edge of the world with a wolf's head medallion warm in his closed fist. The first and only Witcher Westeros had ever known, ready, whatever came next, whatever the realm eventually decided to call him, to meet it entirely on his own terms.